Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to the special meeting of the Town of Easton's Finance Committee. Today is Wednesday, May 1st, 2019, and this meeting is being recorded and it is being televised. I want to thank you all for participating and joining us tonight. This is a first for me where I've seen so many interested in the Finance Committee meeting, so welcome to all of you. By way of logistics, I want you to know that there's extra seating in the lunchroom out here with a live feed that's going on, so if you want to be comfortable, I encourage you to take go grab a seat and make yourselves comfortable. We will invite public comment at the earlier portion of the meeting in order to honor and thank you and respect your time tonight and appreciate you for coming. So without further ado, we will get into our agenda for tonight's meeting. The purpose of tonight's meeting, I mentioned, is a special meeting of the Finance Committee, but why do we call that special? Well, under usual and customary circumstances, we meet the second Wednesday of every month, where we do have a town meeting coming up, you all know, on May 20th in the Oliver Ames Auditorium at 7 o'clock. And with the election of our newest members, who I'd like to welcome tonight, Emily Wren and John Giraldez. Thank you both very much. Jamie Stebbins was also recently elected. He had previously been appointed to the Finance Committee during mid-cycle last year. All three of you have been elected in last week's town election. So tonight we welcome you. You're jumping right into prime time in terms of Finance Committee work and the work that we do. So welcome. I want to confirm with you both, Emily and John, can you tell me, have you been sworn in by the town clerk?
Yes.
Yes.
You both have. Terrific. So tonight you are welcome to engage, to participate, to ask questions, and most certainly, having been sworn in, you are eligible to vote tonight on tonight's warrant articles. So thank you. Tonight, I want to again remind everyone that the sole purpose of the Finance Committee is to consider any and all municipal questions for the purpose of making reports or recommendations to the town, right? To the town, not to the town administrator and not to the school committee or other subcommittees, but rather we're here to make recommendations to the town broadly. Now, having said that, and with that, I let you know that our job is reviewing the warrant articles, and as many of you know, the warrant articles, we have over 30 of them that will be voted on at town meeting on May 20th. We've only reviewed and voted on a handful of them to this point. Tonight's agenda, primarily, and for the bulk of the work that we need to do tonight, is to review the warrant articles and make our recommendations to the town about what those warrant articles are. Now, having said that, we recognize and again welcome and appreciate your participation here in tonight's meeting. We do have an agenda item that was posted for community participation listed as item 5 on our agenda. In recognition of your participation, understanding the concerns that you have, the interest and desire to express your concerns, and to be able to speak publicly and make your concerns known not only to your Finance Committee members, but to the town broadly and at large, we are going to invite the public to speak and to talk about your concerns and let us know what you have on your mind. With that, there are a couple caveats, right? We've got to put some rules in place. As chairman, I'm going to put some rules in place. And those rules are going to be this, that we're going to limit it to 20 minutes worth of comment time because of the nature of tonight's meeting. And again, in light of the fact that we, as Finance Committee, have the authority to make recommendation to the town, but we cannot and do not dictate the use of funds by the school committee and by the schools. Like you, we are concerned about the structural deficits that we face, the financial constraints that we face, and we've seen your comments. We heard students speak Monday night at the Board of Selectmen meeting. We heard the passion from students and parents. And we honor you. So, without further ado, I'm going to open the floor to those who would like to speak tonight. Hold on just a moment. Again, I'm going to remind you about the rules, 20 minutes. We have heard a lot of your concerns. We've heard a lot about your statements already through social media, through emails, through public discourse, through personal conversations. Please do try to keep your comments brief so that others will have an opportunity to speak. We are grateful that you're here. If you're 18 years of older, please do introduce yourself by full name and address. If you're under 18, please use only your first name and maybe say the grade that you are in. A reminder to all of you, this is a publicly televised meeting and it is recorded. The information you share is private. And it is online, ad nauseum, ad infinitum, for all the world to see. I caution you about your own privacy and what you're willing to state on publicly like this and what you're willing to put out there for the rest of us. So with that caution, I, again, invite you and welcome you. Please, who'd like to speak first? Please do, Kyla.
Do I come up?
Please do come to the microphone.
There isn't one. Oh, that one.
Here, yeah. Oh, God, I didn't want that to happen.
Thank you. Kyla Bennett, 2 Chickadee Lane. Thank you, Madam Chair, for that heartwarming introduction. I really appreciate that. And I'm really glad that you watched the Board of Selectmen meeting on Monday night. For those of you who haven't watched it, I urge you to watch it, at least the portion, if you don't want to hear Connor go on again about his budget presentation, which was very good, but it was a little long, to just skip to the part where you hear the kids speak, because I have never been so proud of children that were not my own in my life. They were amazing, and I think it's worth hearing. The reason there aren't more people here tonight is because there is a music event going on tonight, and a lot of parents and children, all the string instrument kids are there. Otherwise, we would have flooded this room the way we did on Monday night. As you know, the schools are facing significant budget cuts. You know that, you're aware of it. I know it's hard for you, it's hard for us. But we believe that this can be alleviated by tapping into about $500,000 of the free cash or reserves that are available. We have about $4 million in there, and I know that Connor and the Board of Selectmen told us that they have these guidelines about how that money is supposed to be used, and they want to try to be cautious, and we understand that and we appreciate that. However, those guidelines also say that in unusual economic circumstances, an additional portion of free cash may be used for the ensuing year's school or municipal operating budget. While the term unusual economic circumstances is not defined in those guidelines, we firmly believe that we are faced with an unusual economic circumstance, or more than one. We're faced with significant and unexpected increase in charter school contributions. We're faced with an increase in serious social and emotional needs of the children in the Easton schools that require adjustment counselors. We are thankfully getting more diverse, and as such we have more children where English is not their first language and they need ELL. We have a rapid drop in literacy rates. You know all this. I don't need to go through this. And unfortunately, one of the first things that's always cut is music and the arts. And as you can tell from the kids who were at the Board of Selectmen meeting Monday night and the ones that are here tonight, music is so, so important to this school and to these kids. I'm sorry. My kids both went through this program, and the music program literally saved my son's life, and it has saved other children's lives. And this is not hyperbole. So I just want you to keep that in mind as we move forward with this. Colleen Less had a great analogy, which is if you've got a roof and it's leaking, you don't say, I don't have the money to fix the whole roof, so we're just gonna leave it there, and then hopefully next year when we do, get more money, or I win the lottery, I'm gonna fix my roof. Because by then, the water's gonna leak through and your house might be gone. And in this case, we have a really big leak. And what we're asking for is a stopgap measure. We're asking for enough money to put a tarp up there so that the house is not flooded, so our schools are not damaged. Because you say, okay, well, this is just for a year, maybe we can pass an override, but these kids are gonna fall so far behind. The kids who need these ELL services, the kids who need the adjustment counselors, the kids who need the music, they will fall far behind. They will not be able to get that year back, and it will affect a lot of people. So we are requesting, respectfully, that the Finance Committee consider urging the Board of Selectmen and Connor to take either $522,302, which is 25% of free cash, or $500,000 from the stabilization fund to fund all of these things in the school budget. And we know this is just, people keep saying, well, what if there's a huge economic crisis? What if the bottom falls out of the market and that $500,000 is not going to save us if there's that kind of collapse. That's not going to be the thing that kills us if there's that kind of collapse. We are begging you for this money. We are begging you for this support to fill this hole in the school budget. We are saddened that the school committee didn't fight for this. We're saddened that the Board of Selectmen did not agree with us. There is precedent for the Finance Committee to stand up to, you are a check and a balance for the rest of these boards and committees and for the town administrator. You are the financial watchdog, and I understand that money is tight, but this is critical. We're in trouble, and we need your help. So I'm begging you to please consider this for the kids, for the parents, and for the schools. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyla. Would anyone else like to speak? Well, I thank you all very much for coming, for participating, for contributing, and for engaging. We are not able to deliberate on the comments that Kyla just presented to us. We will move forward with our agenda, and we will proceed to consider the warrant articles for recommendation tonight. You, of course, are welcome to stay and participate, but we're going to move ahead with our agenda, and I thank you all very, very much for your time and participation.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, at this time, we will invite and recognize that we have Stephanie Danielson, the Director of Planning and Economic Development here, Mike Blanchard, Assistant Town Administrator, Wendy Nightingale, our Finance Director and Town Accountant, and Connor Reed, Town Administrator here to help walk us through those warrant articles that remain outstanding to us. We have previously voted on Articles 1 through 4, 14, 16, 17, 19, 20, and 21. And just to be sure, John, Emily, you both have warrant articles that you've got your printout of these? Yes. Excellent. Everyone else on the committee have your materials?
Did we confirm that those are the right numbers? Because we had this issue last time.
We confirmed that they're the right numbers. Excellent. Okay. We're going to start with the CPA articles, and Stephanie Danielson, please, or Mike, either one or the other. Okay, Stephanie? Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
We're going to start with, I believe the first one for you is going to be at Article 22, the community preservation budget.
And I think this item is self-explanatory. It is the budget for the Community Preservation Committee for the year 2020.
I will ask you, Stephanie, if you don't mind, can you explain what the purpose of the community preservation funds are, or the limitations and restrictions around those funds?
Certainly, it would be my pleasure. The Community Preservation Act was legislation that was enacted to allow communities to, through a local legislative act, adopt the Community Preservation Act and set aside funds, it's a small surcharge, against the assessed value of properties every year. And also the state collects monies in, from the Registry of Deeds for sales of property. That's where the funding comes from. The money is specifically to be used for community preservation projects. And those projects include affordable housing, it includes open space and recreation, and it includes historic preservation. Those are somewhat broad categories, but again, in our case, the town has received in the past requests from the Easton Housing Authority for funding to preserve housing by doing major repairs that need to be done to certain of their housing complexes in the town, and it also helps fund the Affordable Housing Trust. And when we get to that particular item, I'll talk about some of the projects they've undertaken. Open space and recreation, there are some restrictions. Open space, the money can be used for acquisition of land that is to be permanently protected as open space, and it can also be used to restore natural areas that have been degraded over time. It can be used for outdoor recreation facilities. And then the historic preservation can be used for a variety of historical preservation projects. The ones that are most commonly known and visible are rehabilitation or restoration efforts that's made to historic structures, such as the Shovel Works Complex or the Oaks Ames Memorial Hall. It can also be used for archival methods for historic documents. So it does have a little bit of breadth there as well.
Very good, thank you. I do have a question for you, just that has come up through the public discussion and dialogue and some of the questions that I've heard, seen, witnessed, or been asked directly. Can community preservation funds be used toward any of the operational budget deficits experienced by the school?
No, it cannot. And in fact, when Bridgewater, the town of Bridgewater had first adopted the Preservation Act, they thought that they could temporarily transfer money to their operating budget with the intent of repaying that money in the future, and they had to immediately move the money back into the CPA.
Thank you very much. Thank you for explaining that. Does anyone else have any other questions on the committee?
What is the process for projects to be put in the pipeline or put up for consideration?
So every year, the Community Preservation Committee has an open grant application process. It usually begins in November. The process the last couple of years has involved a step where you submit an application for eligibility determination. This is so that someone doesn't have a project, and if they haven't talked to either staff or the Community Preservation Committee to find out if it's eligible or to help them kind of format their project, they submit a full application and find out that it's not eligible. So that first step was to help everyone know and understand if their project was eligible or if certain portions of their project were eligible. That was followed after a 2-month kind of open period and application, submittal, determination, and then communication back from the CPC. It was followed by the actual full application process, which has been in January the last couple of years.
When I add up the proposed articles, they amount to almost $1 million in money. $1 million or $100,000 in money? Yeah, almost $1 million.
I have
Okay.
959,900, yep.
So with that, can you just explain the table that's included in the warrant, or what these amounts represent?
Warrant that we're on right now?
Yeah, Article number 12.
I might have to ask Wendy to help with that. Article 12 does not have a table, are you?
Not a table, it's got columns.
Okay,
Article
so-
22, did I
okay, so
misstate? I'm
Article
sorry.
22.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank
So
you.
I'm going to start, and Wendy can jump in. So the administrative expenses, there's a certain percentage, I think it's 25%, 5% of the total revenues received in that year are set aside for administrative expenses. That can cover the cost of administering the act. It can pay if the town is considering, or the CPC is considering acquiring land. It can cover the cost of an appraisal, some of those administrative activities that help the board make their decisions. The debt service covers the bonds that have been used for certain projects, to pay for certain projects. So that's the debt service, paying back the bonds when we've borrowed money from the CPA with the commitment to pay back with CPA funds on the bonds. Reserves are, you have to set aside a certain percentage every year towards each of the categories. So you have to set aside 10% for affordable housing, you have to set aside 10% for open space and recreation, and you have to set aside 10% for historic preservation. You don't have to spend that money in a given year, but you do have to keep it set aside.
Right, or you would have to either set it, if you don't appropriate it for a particular project in that category, then you would have to reserve that money. And so in that article, there's a reserve for historic resources of $31,905. If you add up all of the individual articles that relate to the historic resources, they don't total the 10%. This year's budget is based on an estimated surcharge of $1,250,000 and a distribution from the state trust of $235,000. So that would bring the total estimated receipts up to $1,485,000. 5% of that is the $74,250, which you see for administrative expenses. The debt service is just the debt service on the Dean Street acquisition, Chestnut Street, Governor Ames, and the Gill property. Those all count under the open space category. And then the annual budgeted reserve is basically just the difference between what your total budget is and what you set aside for projects and reserves. So it allows you to, if something comes up during the year, to appropriate money from your estimated revenues after you've already set your tax rate. One thing I also want to mention is we're doing this a little bit differently this year in comparison to previous years. What we used to do is we used to do the whole budget in this one budget article. And then all the individual projects we would just appropriate from undesignated fund balance. Last year, somebody different from our town council didn't like that, and they wanted us to appropriate these particular projects from estimated revenues, and they're in separate articles, so, if you look at this particular article and you add up all of these individual things, you're not gonna come up to 1,485,000, because you have to add in some of these, other projects to come up with that total. I hope that wasn't too long and.
Can I ask a question about
Yes.
the way that it's bucketed, I guess, the
Mhm.
10%?
Mhm.
When you're appropriating from the various different articles,
Mhm.
does it have to come from the individual line item accounts essentially, and then you could backfill that from the reserves, or are those reserves also tied to those individual accounts? So is there an affordable housing reserve that then would fund the affordable housing fund?
There could be. In fact, this particular year, for community housing, we did have a reserve of $46,000. We are planning on using that reserve. So the amount in in Article 23 is 200,000. We really only have to reserve or spend 148,500, which is 10% of that budget.
Right.
So this is 200,000. So when the motion is made at town meeting, the motion will be to take like 154,000 from estimated community preservation receipts and 46,000 from the reserve. That way we still meet the spending requirement, we're able to use that reserve, and it's kind of the best of both worlds for that particular case.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I'm not an accountant. Does this presentation of this article adequately then address the things that you've just said in terms of what we're voting on or recommending here?
Yes, if, taking into account the other articles. So, all right, so in this case, Article 23, you would be taking 154,000 from estimated revenues. The Tufts Farm Assessment Plan, that would be also coming from estimated revenues. The Elise Circle roof replacement and the Moscato Stadium, those would be coming from unreserved fund balance because you'd already be meeting the spending requirements from some of the other articles. So those would come from unreserved fund balance. But the Oaks Ames Hall, that would come from estimated receipts. Smith Farmhouse, the article for the cemetery fence restoration, and then the Unionville pickleball courts would be coming from unreserved fund balance.
Got it. I don't have any additional questions. Committee?
Just, so if Article 22 were to be passed, and then one of the other articles related to the CPA funding was not passed, what would happen then?
It would depend on which one it was, and if we were still able to meet the spending requirements. If that was not the case, then what we would probably do at that point is probably come back at the special town meeting and make up for it then before we set the tax rate. Because you really can't modify these articles because they're supposed to be recommended by the CPC, and they can only come to town meeting if they are recommended. So you'd have to, go back and do that. And so the best way to probably do that would be through the special town meeting in the fall.
Thank you. I'll entertain a motion.
Which number are we on, 22? Motion to approve Article 22, report and fiscal year 2020 budget of the Community Preservation Committee.
Second.
All in favor? And the article passes. The article passes, the recommendation passes. We recommend.
We recommend.
We recommend. Thank you. And Stephanie, if you'll proceed now through Article 23.
Okay, Article 23 is the request for a sum of $200,000, which has been the standard request for the Affordable Housing Trust for the past several years. Some of the accomplishments that the trust has realized this year is we are nearing a final memorandum of agreement with Global Properties and BMZ for 300 Foundry Street, which is a property that was owned by the town. We went out to bid. We sought proposals from qualified firms to develop that property into a group home for individuals with acquired brain injury. That project is coming to fruition. The Affordable Housing Trust went out with a proposal to sell off on another parcel of land owned by the town for a development of an affordable housing house, an affordable house. That award was granted to Habitat for Humanity, and they will be starting that project over the summer, construction of that project. And the Affordable Housing Trust with, again, and this is all with money they've received in the past, primarily through the CPA funding, they purchased a home for resale as a permanently deed-restricted affordable home. And that house was purchased in the fall, repairs were made, and it went on the market about 2 months ago. There's an open house, there's a lottery to solicit qualified individuals. We've received a very good response to that, and again, expect that to proceed pretty quickly.
Should we read these?
No. You can, though.
Okay. The CPA wants it here.
Okay,
All in connection. I think that's less impactful than some of the other ones that are outstanding.
okay.
Question about the Habitat for Humanity. Is that something that we, forgive me for not knowing how it works, do we go out and request their involvement for a potential parcel, or is it part of a bid process?
When the town has land that they are looking to dispose of, and for a particular purpose, we need to go out with an RFP, a request for proposals. We need to receive responses back from qualified individuals and award it to the most advantageous proposal. And in this case, it's not necessarily a monetary value. It's can this individual or firm actually construct the project and meet the needs and apply the permanent deed restriction to the property, which is what we're looking to do.
Excellent. Thank you.
Very good. Any other questions? Article 23, CPA funding, Affordable Housing Trust, fiscal year 20 programs, includes language to see if the town will vote in accordance with the recommendation of the Community Preservation Committee to appropriate the sum of $200,000 from available community preservation funds to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, or take any other action relative thereto. And I'll entertain a motion.
So made.
Tim?
Seconded.
All in favor? And that's unanimous. Thank you very much. The article is recommended. Go ahead. Article 24
is for an assessment and plan for Tufts Farm. Tufts Farm is one of the conservation properties that's owned by the town and under the management and care of the Conservation Commission. It is the only property under the care of the Conservation Commission that has structures on it. And right now, the property is being leased out to a couple who are actually farming it. It's a small family farm. And several of the outbuildings are in desperate need of repair. It also, when the Conservation Commission first went out with this RFP, I think it's in its 7th year with the Luke family. They wanted to try to make it part of a lot larger educational facility to the public on, how you can do farming on a small parcel in town, kind of a family farm. So the proposal here is really to do an assessment of the outbuildings document and understand what the repairs and maintenance needs are for their long-term preservation and use, and put design plans together. It's being done in conjunction with a technical assistance grant at a discount price of $7,500 to work with the Conway School, which is a landscape architect environmental planning school, to determine kind of the broader use and integration with the mission of the Conservation Commission for the property.
Very good. Is there any opportunity for revenues associated with that project?
Not necessarily with the project. The lease does generate an income, a monthly income for the Conservation Commission.
Any other questions? I'll entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor? And Article 24 is recommended.
Article 25, I briefly referenced this when I was talking about the purposes for CPA funds. The Easton Housing Authority has requested funds in the amount of $225,000 to replace the roofs at the Elise Circle. Elise Circle provides housing to a lot of our elderly residents in town, and this money will be used to rehabilitate the building and ensure that those housing units are viable into the future.
Has that cost been professionally estimated, or has that already, will there be a bid process again for that in RFP?
I don't know what their bid process is, if they fall under the same as we do, but we know that this was a competitive bid because that's one of the requirements the CPC has of applications, that you go out and you seek quotes.
Thank you very much. And to go back to Jen's question earlier, all of these articles that we're recommending here tonight or considering tonight have gone through the application process, right? They've gone through the rigmarole, right, to get to this place?
That's right. It includes assessing whether they're eligible or not, discussion by the Community Preservation Committee itself on whether they feel these projects are worthy of funding, and also they need support from the associative other town boards. So, for example, if it's a project associated with recreation, the Recreation Commission needs to review it, and they're asked to make a recommendation. The same for the Historical Commission if it's historical preservation.
Very good. Any other questions? I'll entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor? And Article 25, Elise Circle roof replacement is recommended. Article 26, Easton Public Schools, the Moscato Stadium turf and track resurfacing.
Yes. So this is, this request is for work associated with a much larger project, which is the rehabilitation of the turf field at the Oliver Ames High School. When that was installed, it was about 10 years ago. These fields are expected to have about a 10-year lifespan, and the turf surface itself is in the process of breaking down. The turf itself, and this is a question that comes up when CPA funding was first made available, you could not pay for an artificial turf field. You cannot pay, today you still cannot pay for the turf itself, but you can fund with CPA funds the prep work, the site prep work. You can pay for the installation. And that is primarily the costs that are covered here. So they're seeking $380,000 for site work, a track bridge and field preparation, and then installation. They have budgeted for an additional $430,564, which will help cover the complete cost through private donations, revolving account, and capital budget.
Is that the delta of, so the 815 is the total project?
Yes.
This is 380. There's 185 plus a couple other pieces here on the capital. The private donations is the balance. Okay. Thank you.
And if I'm not mistaken, we see the balance in the capital budget. Is that correct?
Some of it.
Some portion of
A
it is.
portion.
It's a small,
The turf piece
it's like
itself.
150,
85,000?
yeah.
185, yeah.
It's under 200,000.
Yep. Is the press box lift separate? Yes, because that's an ADA requirement. Okay, never mind.
Any other questions?
Was the turf, where did we net out with there? Was there discussion in the town around the choice of turf material? Where did that net out? I'm not completely sure where we're.
Bill Matthews was at the Board of Selectmen's meeting when this was discussed, and he presented information from the company that does the installation. Actually, it wasn't that does the installation, it was an independent company. And their findings are that the turf fields are not a health hazard. And it's, actually, I think the hazard is associated with the rubber crumb. So there's, and it's literally a rubber crumb. It's crumb material that provides a cushion on the field so that when athletes are, falling into the field and running on the field, it provides a cushion. And that can kind of, especially as the field ages, you can lose some of that. But according to Mr. Matthews, the evidence is such that there is not a health hazard.
Is there an environmental concern about that, disposal or deterioration?
I believe the crumb material will be reused, and the actual turf, the artificial grass, will be disposed of off-site in a
Yeah.
proper facility.
And I understand our job here tonight, right, is not to decide which turf material we're going to use. Connor, where will that be decided? Who does have that authority? The schools will do that?
They've gone through I believe, a design engineering process and procurement as the town would with any of our projects that involve working with DPW, Bill Matthews, and Activaz, I believe. But that is it's a determination for the schools.
Got it. And so our job here tonight, right, is to recommend or not the use of community preservation funds to help replace and restore a track that we know is deteriorating and a turf that needs to be replaced. That's our job here tonight. So
And
any other question? Oh,
I would just like to add to that, and one of the points that Mr. Matthews made at the Board of Selectmen's meeting is that the work that's being funded through the CPA request is work that would need to be done one way or another, regardless of what the surface material was.
very good. Thank you, Stephanie. Any other questions?
What's the expected life of the turf again? The
10
new
to
turf is going to
15
be
years.
10 to 15 years. Okay.
Is there already plans for that private donation gap fill? Has that already been put into effect, whatever that looks like, or do you have any insight into that?
That's my understanding.
Okay.
Anyone else? I'll entertain a motion.
Motion to recommend Article 26.
Thank you, Davis.
Second.
All those in favor? And Article,
All those opposed?
I'm
anyone
abstaining.
opposed? Oh, I'm sorry.
For
Opposed
personal
or
reasons, I
abstaining?
need to abstain on this one.
Abstain, okay.
Yes. I don't,
Stacy, you see that? Thank you. And with that, recommend Article 26, the Moscato Stadium turf and track resurfacing in the amount of $380,000. Article 27, CPA funding for Oaks Ames Memorial Hall fire alarm and radio box.
This one is very straightforward. The Finance Committee will probably recognize, the members that have been on for a while, that Oaks Ames Memorial Hall has received a lot of funding for historic preservation of the building over time. One of the items that they intended to seek funding for or include in their funding request last year was this $8,000 for the fire alarm radio box. It's an upgrade. It's a requirement, a state requirement that they do this because it is a place of gathering. This was a change with the station's fire in Rhode Island that came about, that you need to make sure that you were protecting people in gathering places. So it does fall under one of the allowable uses.
Thank you. Any questions? I'll entertain a motion.
Motion recommend.
Second.
All those in favor? And Article 27 is recommended. Article 28, CPA funding for Smith Farmhouse at Borderlands State Park exterior rehabilitation.
Last year, the Smith Farm requested $49,000 from CPA funds to help with the exterior preservation and restoration of the Smith Farmhouse. This is an iconic farm building located at Borderland. It sits out in the field, so any of you who've gone to Borderland, and especially if you've entered from the back entrance and gone down the road, at the end of the road, you have this big open field, and there sits the farmhouse. They did a lot of the work last year. They are requesting additional funds to do the completion of the exterior work. They have other work that needs to be done at the site, some interior, but that work would not qualify for historic preservation, not because interior work can't be covered, but because the interior work they're doing would not be historic preservation. The building is gutted inside. They're going to refit it for the purposes that their programming requires, but the exterior work does qualify.
I do, oh, go ahead, Patrick.
No, I've talked a lot. Go ahead. You first.
Oh, I thought I talked a lot.
Just because you're the
You want me to
chairperson.
go first?
You go first.
Stacy,
Okay.
go first.
Stacy. We're
We're
doing
gonna
that
go-
again?
Who
Call
did that?
everybody by their last
This is
name.
Jen Stacy for those and we continue to call her Stacy
Kind of
instead
an
of Jen.
inside joke too, so it's all, we're all friends here. Just love you guys.
Stace.
Borderland is a DCR property, so
Yes,
how
it
does
is.
this end up
is my
qualifying as, oh, I stole it from you.
It was
Helen?
last year's question.
How does this end up qualifying as a CPC project when it's a state?
That's a question that people have asked.
Yeah.
The ownership of a property does not preclude the project from being eligible for historic preservation funds. Last year, when this came before the Community Preservation Committee, the question was, how does the town protect their interest? So right now, the town's holding a preservation restriction against the Oliver Ames, the Oaks Ames Memorial Hall. That means that that building has to be permanently protected as a historic structure. That protects the town's investment in that preservation. The same with the Shovel Works project. It's not mandated, but the CPC has required that in the past. So that came up. That was a question, and the state doesn't enter into. The response was the state won't enter into a historic preservation document with the town. However, it's in the state's interest. They have these curator programs, which is what this is. The tenants at the Smith Farm are curators. They put a proposal together for use of and rehabilitation of that property, and it's a long-term project, and it's the intent of the state to keep that property and keep that building preserved. So that is the Community Preservation Committee felt that was enough to warrant it. They also last year talked about the fact that, yes, it's a state property, and Easton has its own properties and buildings, but it's one that sits in Easton, and it's one that everyone in Easton also benefits from.
This is also run by a nonprofit?
Yes.
And they've been, so if they decide to make any changes to the exterior, actually invest money into it, who is it? So then we could make an investment into this and it could be changed by the nonprofit at their discretion?
No, they'd need to come back to the town.
Okay. And do you know how much they're allocating towards the rehabilitation as well, or is that just kind of,
There,
is there like a match funding for what we're investing into the building, or has the state invested any money into it as well?
so, let's see, I have that printed out here. They have, I think there was, on the exterior work, it looks like they are seeking funds totally from the CPC. And there have been some donated funds that are being used for the interior work. And frequently when there's a match and there's work that's eligible for CPA funding and work that isn't, you'll see that they'll use their portion of funds towards those ineligible.
Want to say something? Anybody?
Yeah, just building on that a bit, building on Tim's question. What are the terms for the nonprofit in terms of what they're expected to do as part of their long-term lease? It's mentioned here that they have in return for the long-term lease. So what are they providing? Like what conditions or expectations do they have to maintaining or investing in the property?
The expectation would be that the Historical Commission would kind of retain an eye on the property to ensure that no changes are made that aren't in line with the historic nature of the structure.
But there's no financial or specified commitment on, okay.
Go wait, Connor, if you want.
The article mentions the health and wellness program. What is done at Smith Farm?
Oh, well, their programming is, it's a holistic health program where they offer services to veterans as well as other individuals. And it's kind of a nature-based program to heal people with post-traumatic stress disorder and other health inflictions.
Are they gonna be working on, is it gonna be working farm by the time it's all said and done, or is it just gonna be the historical building from a?
No, I don't, the intent, as far as I know, is not that it's going to be restored as a working farm. They're going to be providing this programming. So, for example, my understanding is over the course of the summer, because right now they can't, the interior's gutted, so they can't do any interior programming. But they've had some yoga sessions and just outdoor healing activities.
Got it.
They were awarded last year at town meeting. Were there any other, like any other grants or any other receipt of funds they've had in support of maintenance of the property?
They have had donations.
Okay.
And they have done fundraising.
Okay.
Is there an anticipated end cost for this, or is this gonna be, we did 49,000 last year, then another?
They have informed us that this is the last time they'll be coming to CBC for funds. And again, I think this is the extent of the qualified work.
So this would kind of get us to the point where
Right.
we've done everything we can do for that?
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Okay.
And I don't know, I mean, if anybody's been down there and seen the work that they've done, I mean, there is a significant difference between what it looked like and what it looks like now.
Do you know if this is the only building that this nonprofit has?
I don't.
Emily, what was your question? I'm sorry.
I asked if she knew if this was the only building that this nonprofit was using for their veteran services.
Oh, I see. Any other questions? Comments, concerns? I'll entertain a motion.
I'd like to make a motion to recommend Article 28.
Second.
All those in favor? All those opposed? Any abstain? Got it. Stacy, you saw? Thank you. We will recommend Article 28 for Smith Farmhouse at Borderland State Park exterior rehab in the amount of $43,000. The Finance Committee will note that this was the last time. Article 29, Southeastern Cemetery Corporation.
And this is for repair of the cast iron fence that is located at the Southeastern Cemetery, which is located on Washington Street across from Stonehill College. I think people are familiar with it, would recognize the iron fencing that is in place there.
Any questions about that? Any motion?
Sorry, so moved. Motion to recommend Article 29.
Second.
All those in favor? All those opposed?
Abstain.
Abstain. Thank you, Tim. Finance Committee recommends Article 29, and we move on to Article 30, the infamous pickleball court article.
Yes. Now, this originally, the eligibility grant.
Infamous, more than famous.
Oh, I know what the word means.
He's an English major.
I got the first laugh of the night. Very good. Have we argued about this before?
No,
Not
we've not
personally.
argued, no, personally, no.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
So this first came to the town as an eligibility, and the eligibility application was for around $200,000 for construction of the pickleball courts, and it was determined that really to construct these courts, you need to design them. Also need to take into consideration parking needs at the playground, as well as accessibility. So right now, the park itself, the playground, isn't very accessible. So the amount being sought is $38,000 to do the design work. And we will expect to see, once the design work is done, a request for funding of the courts themselves next year.
Which part?
One of the things I would
Right
like to...
across from the beanery.
This is next to the Union Villa.
Got it, okay.
There's a underutilized softball field that's located there. There's a playground. The playground would still remain. There are tennis courts there. There's a question about the softball field itself, but there may be an opportunity to repurpose that as well. So part of that will be incorporated into the design. This particular project meets several needs that were identified in the Envision Easton Master Plan process for recreation, in providing recreation opportunities for all members of the Easton residency, including people of all ages. Pickleball is particularly popular with seniors. It's also popular with younger people, so it will provide a facility for people of all ages. And providing more recreational activities and facilities for the aging population in Easton was one of the needs identified in the updated open space and recreation plan.
Will there be any considerations, Connor, from the DPW in terms of future costs and maintenance and things like that? Stephanie?
So that was
That's Stephanie,
discussed.
sure.
And again, when we were going through the development of the Envision Easton Master Plan and talking about recreation facilities and the needs of the town, one of the things that was made very clear, and this came from the rec department as well as the DPW and other members of the community, that we need to be able to take care of the facilities that already exist. And any new facilities, you need to determine what is the ongoing maintenance going to be and how are you going to fund that. The pickleball courts in and of themselves, if you maintain them, you keep them well repaired. If cracks develop, you crack seal them as soon as the cracks develop. You will extend the life of those facilities long into the future. They also are generating income because there's a cost for the program, which is being administered through the rec department. So there are fees that are coming in that will help pay for ongoing costs. So for example, down the road, you'd expect that you're going to have to replace the nets. well, there'll be money that's coming in that can be set aside to cover those future costs.
Thank you.
I don't, in all transparency, I don't know what pickleball is.
I've never seen it. I
ask the same
understand that you probably go by on a nice summer morning and drive by, and I hear they're out there playing. And it's played with a racket on a smaller version of a tennis court. In fact, right now what they're doing is, I think they can divide the tennis courts up into 4 pickleball courts. They mark them out, and you play it with a racket and something that looks like a wiffle ball.
But so it was definitely affirmed that this is a popular
Oh,
pastime.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It is across the nation.
Welcome.
Emily, welcome.
Right?
My fellow planners
Well done.
are all talking about
Okay.
this. Yes.
That's all I need.
Yeah.
Great.
That's fantastic. You did mention this is near the Union Village. Will Bill's benefit in any way from new parking or I don't know where I know this is all in the planning
Union Villa?
stages, but yeah, will the Union Villa,
Well, I don't know that we're going to police the parking after hours. The parking will be provided for use of the fields. I mean, that will be its primary purpose.
Pickleball players gotta eat too, I guess.
and drink.
One question about the program itself. Would generated costs for that program be allocated back to the program, just a revolving fund specifically for the aims of that program and the repair of the facilities, et cetera?
recreation
Or would it be
department.
just the general recreation department?
I don't know the answer to that question.
I would think it would go through the recreation revolving fund.
Just in allocation as
It would
needed?
just stay in there.
Got it.
Just on a side note on the design, that's also a field that the fire department uses for emergency landing zone for helicopters too. So we get to call in medical ambulances through the air.
Very good.
That's one of our spots. So multi-purpose already.
So with the nets and all that, does that take away that as an option?
Really?
When they do the design phase, I'm sure they'll meet with all the departments about it anyway. So it goes through that process. And we can either eliminate it as a possibility and move it to another area, or find what the requirements are. I mean, it's pretty small requirements on a helicopter. But it should probably back.
Yeah,
There's still
I think,
softball field
yeah.
area. It's probably big enough for us.
Deference to the
We
helicopter.
did meet with Greg Swan to just kind of get a rough idea, and he kind of sketched something out, and I think there would be an area on the south side
Right.
of that would still be available. And that area is all relatively flat.
Right, okay.
Any other questions? Okay.
Eliminated pickleball conversation.
It was,
I'd like to make a motion to recommend Article 30.
Second that.
all those in favor? All those abstaining or all those opposed? Tim, I'm sorry, I didn't see your vote.
I am for
Affirmative. Oh, there we go. Okay, it's unanimous. Thank you. We are recommending $38,000 for 6 new pickleball courts, planning, design, and engineering. Thank you, Stephanie. And lastly, we do have a zoning article that I believe is just correcting.
It is a correction. Last year, when this was advanced to town meeting, there was a restriction that was intended to be added, which was that the units constructed under this zoning would be limited to 2 bedrooms, so, meaning per unit. And that was inadvertently omitted from the bylaw. So
Thank
it's
you.
just
And we did
updated.
see that the planning board did approve and recommend this.
Yes.
So, thank you. Any questions from the committee? I'd entertain a motion.
Motion amendment?
And seconded?
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor? All those opposed? We're good. Unanimous vote for the zoning change to 2 bedrooms. Thank you, Stephanie.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
for being here and for
Thank you.
entertaining our questions. Mike, if you would, please, for the administrative articles. And I'm going to let you guide me through which ones you
Sure,
plan
we're
to
gonna,
go through.
jump around a little. So good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Blanchard, for those I've not met. I'm the Assistant Town Administrator, and congratulations to our newest members. I'm going to start off with Articles 5, 6, and 7, and then we're going to jump around a little after that, but if we want to start there.
Very good.
So Article 5, payment of bills from a prior fiscal year. It's a housekeeping item that appears every year on the town meeting warrant. There are currently no bills to be paid from the prior fiscal year. As a result, the Board of Selectmen only voted to include this. There was no need to recommend it, and the same would be true for the Finance Committee tonight, but just as a point of information to update you, if prior bills were to come forward before town meeting, that would be a future vote at a future meeting to recommend that. If not, it would be dismissed on May 20th at the floor town meeting.
Very good. And we do have a Finance Committee meeting scheduled for next week, a regular meeting, and we do have time allocated prior to town meeting. So just in case, thank you, Mike. So we can recommend to include, right?
Do we have to do it?
No, the selectmen include.
The selectmen included it, so
automatically,
we're good. We don't need to
don't
do
need to
anything
take
tonight.
No action tonight.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Article 6, supplemental FY19 budgets. There is one budget, at this time town council budget requires additional funding of $25,000. Town council budget funds our general counsel, our labor council, and our special counsel services. The additional funding needed this year is reflective of the fact that we had 8 union contracts that were up and being negotiated this year, as well as 2 10-year term cable licensing agreements with Comcast and Verizon. So we're recommending that $25,000 be transferred from the FY19, there's available funds, the FY19 employee benefit insurance budget. The Board of Selectmen voted to include this article on March 11th. They voted to recommend this article on April 29th, and we're seeking your recommendation tonight.
We do see that Article 9, 10, and 11 refer to funding the collective bargaining agreements. Have those been resolved?
They're ongoing.
Yeah, I think
I'll
Connie will
speak
speak
to
to those on his turn.
Does that reflect the 25K that's here?
No, so the 25K is as a result of the council's time and efforts as part of the negotiations that are still, some have been resolved, some are still ongoing.
Could this number change for 20? Or would that come out of money that's already?
This is an estimate for the
Budgeted for-
balance of the fiscal year,
Yeah.
so we don't believe that this would change.
We don't anticipate that the labor council bills will be as high as they were this year, next year. And we wanted the cable contract to negotiate either. I think that should be done.
Very good. Any questions from the committee? I'll make a motion to recommend.
Motion to recommend Article 6.
Second?
Article 6 is recommended.
We haven't.
We didn't vote.
voted on
Oh,
it.
did we? Sorry. We have a motion, we have a second.
Leadership.
All those in favor? All those opposed?
One abstention.
One abstention. Thank you, Tim. Okay, Article 7, Mike?
Sure, so one of the many long-term financial liabilities the town has to plan for is something called OPEB, which stands for Other Post-Employee Benefits. That's basically the accumulated cost estimate for retiree healthcare costs that the town will ultimately be responsible for. Thankfully, not all at once, because the current estimate is $100 million. The town does pay its yearly share of retiree health costs out of the operating budget, but as time goes on, more people retire. Many of those positions, most people replace them, so the number of health plans and ultimately the costs grow each year. Therefore, it's important for towns to try to set aside funding whenever possible. In Easton's case, that's been difficult, given our budget situation, which you'll all be discussing. We've currently set aside, I believe it's approximately $115,000.
118.
118, so even better, in the OPEB trust account, but again, that is against an estimated liability of $100 million. One of the uses of free cash or available funds from the current year is to try to plug away at some of that liability, even in small amounts. The efforts are important, especially as part of our bond rating, to show that we're making efforts to address and fund that liability. I think this is also important to note that 5 of the town unions that have ratified their contracts have agreed to language that once all the unions agree to that same language, they'll start contributing directly to the town's trust fund themselves. So that's a step in the right direction. We are recommending $25,000 be transferred from available FY19 employee benefits and insurance budget funds. The Board of Selectmen voted to include this article on April 8th and voted to recommend this article on April 29th. And again, we respectfully request your recommendation tonight.
And we previously saw that $50,000 was proposed, so that's changed
That's been
in this
changed.
final warrant article. Any questions? We know that funding the OPEB is not required like funding the pension is. And I think you've explained here that, you know, it's good practice, it's prudent, it's fiscally sound, and I appreciate that you've gone from $50,000 to $25,000, knowing that, yeah, this is still just a tiny fish in a very, very big pond of a lot of fish with a lot of potential liability out there, but we do recognize that, and I appreciate that. Anyway, any other questions about this?
Question, no. You made me think of it. When all ratify, there's some layer of funding that's going to be coming from the individuals or the individual union members into this fund as part of their deductions. Is okay?
Correct.
That was it?
That was it? So if we did have a 50 before and we've got a 25 now, where did that other 25 go?
Deduction?
Did you just ask that question?
No, I'm saying it could be from part of that deduction piece.
We've decided to just reduce it at this time. We are gonna have some money left over in health insurance, but we also are facing significant assessments this year. So just like next year, the charter school assessment is an issue. It's an issue this year also. It was also under budgeted when the cherry sheet assessments were assigned to Easton. I think they only put in about $75,000 for the charter school assessment, and it's probably going to be more like $345,000. So we are going to have to make up that difference through, you know, just savings in the budget, and so that's part of the reason why we decided to reduce that request from $50,000 to $25,000.
But we don't see another line item go up somewhere? I'm sorry, I'm not the accountant, so if this is in a budget someplace,
Where's that other 25K?
where's the other 25? Where
So-
did it get added to?
So the $25,000 it'll be a transfer from the general fund into the OPEB trust fund.
So the other
So that part I
25
get, so the other 25 stays in the general fund.
It would just contribute to more free cash.
Yeah, it's not moving.
So I'm going to ask the question for
Unallocated.
you. Can that money go into the school?
You could use that as a funding source potentially for next year, but I would certainly caution in doing that, because any of that savings is going to contribute to next year's free cash certification. And over the last several years, that number has been declining. So I think we went from like 2.6 million to 2.4 million to 2 million this year. And I would not be at all surprised if our certification ends up being less than 2 million. So I would just be cautious in doing something like that, because you're basically still robbing Peter to pay Paul, because it's money that we would then use next year toward next year's operating budget and the structural revenue deficit.
Understood. Any other questions? I'll make a motion to fund the OPEB fund in the amount of $25,000.
Second?
All those in favor? All those opposed? Any abstain? Tim is abstaining. Stacy, thank you very much. Article 7 is recommended.
So now, if I may, I would jump to Article 12. The approval of a tax agreement with Eastman Street Solar. So this article authorizes the Board of Selectmen to enter into a tax agreement with this Eastman Street Solar at 35 Eastman Street. Basically a tax agreement, or otherwise known as a pilot, which is a payment in lieu of taxes. Reason for this is the law is not clear with regard to solar panels specifically, and there's a lot of uncertainty about their tax status. So in a best case scenario, they're taxed as part of normal property value. In a worst case, they're actually tax exempt, and we wouldn't receive any property tax as a result of their installation. So kind of two sides to this is that industry, because this is an investment, ultimately they want to make money, they want some certainty on what their expenditures are going to be. So a pilot provides them some clarity over the next 20 years, which is the life expectancy of the panels, of what their costs will be. And conversely, it makes the revenue picture very clear for us, so that there's not a change midstream and something changes at the state level. It's expected that this system would be installed this year and be operational as of January 1st of 2020. And the tax agreement would generate over $42,500 in new growth in FY21. And again, that would be added permanently to the levy, just like any new growth would. The total payments over the course of the 20 years to the town would be just under $330,000. And the first year of that payment represents the full freight, as if it was taxed normally. And it's the same model that's been used in previous agreements of this nature. The Board of Selectmen voted to include this article on April 8th. In your warrant, it does indicate they recommended it. I just did want to note that that is an error. They did not take a vote to recommend the article. That simply was a function of our agenda setting and timing. It did not make it onto the agenda, so it wasn't a purposeful omission. So they will be voting that at a future meeting, and we'll be able to provide the recommendation on the floor at town meeting.
Did we do this with the other solar array
Yes.
2 years ago? Thank you.
Good memory.
Yeah.
Go
Go ahead, no, you.
These kinds of agreements are pretty standard across.
Very standard. They're encouraged because there is that uncertainty. And this also gives us some protection. So because we're into this agreement, if something were to become more clear, especially not in our favor, like for example, they are tax exempt, we continue to be in this agreement. So that provides us some protection.
Very good.
Could they sue to get out of the agreement at that point? If the law itself, maybe I'm using the wrong terminology here, but if the law itself changes and this is becoming a tax exempt piece, could they raise that as a legal challenge?
I would have to check with the assessor, but I believe there might be some language.
Yeah, the contracts contemplate that because it's technically, if you do this, not a tax.
Right.
You're agreeing, right? So
Got it. Thank
it's
you.
a good model.
And then just one more question, innocent, ignorant question. New growth fiscal year 2021 of 45.5, will that go into the same bucket as all new growth? And I'm thinking about this in terms of the DIF plan and other new growth calculations for 21?
Yes, it would be new growth, but the DIF would have nothing to do with this. The DIF is only sewer-specific growth in the specific target area, so this is just growth that would show up in the new growth ledger
Okay.
under total taxation in fiscal 21,
Got it.
which would permanently boost the tax levy by that number, which was good. The one that we did 2 years ago was a larger project that permanently boosted the tax levy by over $80,000. So in fiscal 18, that was 80,000 of tax revenue collected. 19, it was another, that 80,000 was collected again, and that would be the case forever.
Very good.
Would this affect any fixed structure that they could be added on later, or would that just go to regular taxation at that point if they decide to build something else on that property, or?
Non-solar?
Correct.
Yes, it would be normal growth.
Which is normal growth.
Yeah, this is
Normal tax,
the
whatever.
agreement basically about the panels themselves.
Right.
Okay, very good.
It's revenue. Any other questions?
You said that this is, the new growth is you just made me think of it. It's 42,000 in the first year, and then I'm assuming it's a diminishing scale from then for the rest of the remainder of the 30 years?
There's a depreciation schedule at the outset.
Thank you. Thank you. That was it.
There's my accountant.
If you want to get audited. Motion to recommend Article 12.
All those in favor? All those opposed? And Article 12 is recommended.
We could hop right into Article 13.
Sure thing.
That's a septic loan program. So the Septic Betterment Program provides low-interest loans to eligible homeowners that have failed septic systems, and it's administered through the Board of Health. Its current form was approved in 2011 by town meeting when they authorized $200,000 in borrowing. Due to the success and popularity of the program, subsequent borrowing authorizations of $1 million each were approved in 2012, 2013, and 2014. As of today, there's currently just over $500,000 remaining to be loaned out. So this article is requesting an additional $1 million in borrowing to continue to be able to provide funding for this program. I want to note that in addition to failed systems, this loan program is also available to those in the new sewer districts, and it can be used to help with the cost of connecting into the public sewer. The Board of Selectmen voted to include and recommend this article on March 11th. And again, respectfully requesting your approval today, recommendation today.
What is the interest to the town versus the interest to the borrower?
I'm literally just going to ask that. Great job.
You went stealing your thunder tonight.
So it has varied. By law, we have to require 2% over the interest rate the town is charged. I think when this started, it was 0%, so we charged 2%. We're now charged 2%, so the interest to the homeowner is 4%.
Okay.
What's the average cost of a project like this? Like for $1 million, how many new projects does that cover?
That's a great question. So I know, and I'm sorry, I don't have the exact number in front of me. In the existing $3+ million, I believe it's north of 100 septic systems, septic loans that have been given out. And that can vary everything from a complete system, which can range, from $10,000 upwards to $40,000, depending on the project. And it can also be smaller, just for the cost of repairs, specific components of the system. And they are also able to wrap in some of the engineering services and costs associated as well.
What's the, is there a specific qualification outside of being a resident of the town and just applying for it?
And that you have to have a failed system,
Yes.
again, or with the exception of connecting into the public.
Oh, yeah,
service.
okay, perfect. Interesting. Well, that's existed.
Any other questions? I'll entertain a motion.
Motion to recommend.
Second?
All those in favor? Any opposed? And Article 13 is recommended. Thank you.
And then last but not least for my portion is Article 18, acceptance of the deed in lieu of foreclosure for 11 Pebblebrook Road. So just by way of background, 11 Pebblebrook Road is a small 1,242 square foot vacant parcel that's been in tax title since 1991. It actually abuts some town-owned land, which is convenient. The parcel was supposed to be transferred to the town when this neighborhood was developed. It was just a small sliver, it's not buildable, but for various reasons, the ball seemed to have been dropped and just never was actually transferred to the town. So the treasurer collector, upon doing a review of properties that are in tax title, which she does on a regular basis, reached out to the owner of the property, who expressed an interest to deed the property to the town in lieu of foreclosure. So basically that leaves us with a choice. So when the property is in tax title, the town can move forward with a petition to file for foreclosure. That's a process. There's costs associated with that, both for the filing of the petition, for lawyer fees, et cetera. But we have the choice here to avoid that process and basically accept the deed in lieu of that. The treasurer collector has recommended this really just as a smart financial proposition because it would cost us more to pursue the foreclosure than we would get from the taxes due, which is $3,500. So the Board of Selectmen voted to include and recommend this article on March 11th, and we ask for your recommendation tonight.
Any questions from the committee? Any motion from the committee?
Make a motion to recommend, Article 18.
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor? None opposed? That's unanimous. Article 18 is recommended. Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
What's that?
Connor guy better watch out. This is pretty
Dangerous to say in Easton.
it's true.
Thank you all. Wendy, are you addressing any articles for us directly?
I just figured if Connor was gonna come up to do the budget, I'd just stay.
Perfect.
Sure.
Thank you very much. We invite Connor Reed, Town Administrator, to join us and introduce and walk us through articles. Yeah, the rest of them. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. My name is Connor Reed. I'm the town administrator. Congratulations to our 2 newly elected members. Just need one moment of your time to get connected here.
I'm gonna hydrate. Cherry chapstick.
Great. So good evening. Again, thank you. My name is Connor Reed. I'm the town administrator here in Easton. This says presentation 4, April 29th. That's not correct. I haven't had a whole lot of time to go back in and dig in on this since Monday night when it was presented to the Board of Selectmen. It was a great presentation. It was a great conversation. I appreciate the folks who were there Monday as well as the folks who are here again tonight. I'll try to be a little bit more succinct compared to that presentation because I'm aware that it's 9 o'clock already. So this is the 4th presentation, but it's been many more times that we've been talking about budget as a community between school committee, finance committee, board of selectmen. This is the balanced budget that I've proposed for town meeting that has been includes the budget adopted by the school committee and has been voted as presented here to be included and recommended in the warrant by the Board of Selectmen. This presentation will cover a variety of important topics, some of which were touched on in related warrant articles tonight, including historic revenue challenges that the town is facing, the status of our reserves, so we've had a lot of good questions about that tonight and Monday, and what that translates into to produce this balanced budget. So, again, I did not update the slide, forgive me, that should say May 1st. Tonight's the culmination of more than 6 months of budget planning, countless hours of review with staff, numerous public meetings and hearings with elected officials and the public, including joint hearings with the Finance Committee in March, all towards the necessary production of a balanced budget for consideration by town meeting this May. The calendar that's on the screen behind me is a highlight of where we are and where we've come since November in 2018. Anything in green, which I know is probably quite difficult to see due to how small the font is, represents public meetings, public deliberative processes. However, as this calendar kind of shows the things that we've done publicly and that we've been working on since November, the 2020 budget is not directly just a result of those 6 months of work, but it's also informed by financial conditions in Easton and in the state that are more than a decade in the making. When we started this budget process, so the first really public step of any operating budget process is that the town administrator issues what's a preliminary budget message, usually in January or February, that one of the most significant things that that does is takes a look at our preliminary revenue estimates and our projected expenses for the coming year. And so when we did that this year, in this February, the projected deficit that we had was $1.9 million. That was refined to just over $1 million in March. And that deficit has now been eliminated through adjustments to fixed costs, to some revenue projections, most notably the elimination of a assumed $200,000 snow deficit. So we had a mild winter, thankfully, so we had no snow and ice deficit. This also includes the proposed application of $250,000 in capital stabilization funds to reduce the impact of a peak debt service year. And in order to close the rest of that budget gap, town and school department budget increases were reduced by about $440,000 from their preliminary requests. The details of those specific adjustments are available in the budget change memos that have been distributed to the Finance Committee. As a technical point that's worth noting, again, that we discussed on Monday, this proposal includes the school committee's budget, the Easton Public Schools budget that was voted by the school committee. It's an increase of 2.5%. The town and the school work very closely together throughout the budget process to refine what revenues will be available in the coming year. But again, to reiterate, including after the vote on Monday night, the Board of Selectmen do not and cannot direct programming, nor can I. For public schools, no more than the school committee could direct staffing at the fire department. So, in kind of a broad overview, fiscal year 20 is going to be a tough year for Easton. The structural revenue deficit that was born out of the last recession persists. It continues to constrain our ability to deliver services to our residents. A variety of items such as below average health insurance increases, personnel turnover, savings from conservative union agreements, and a mild winter with no snow deficit helped reduce that preliminary projected deficit. However, even with all those things in our favor, recurring revenue growth is not adequate to produce a balanced budget without service reductions. Historically positive growth areas in our revenue side, such as local receipts, have slowed down in recent years, and general reserve fund use in this budget is cut from last year, which necessarily reduces the funds that are available for appropriation to our departments. The most significant revenue challenge that we're facing in fiscal 20 is that state revenue growth, as is typically the case, is quite modest or meager. However, there is a sizable jump of nearly 50% in the assessments to the town by the state. So in addition to getting revenue from the state, we also get assessments that are bills that we have to pay. So our revenue from the state's going up under 2%, our assessments to the state are going up by nearly 50%. And so that results in a net reduction in state revenue available to the town for the first time in a decade. All of this contributes to a balanced budget of $86,435,439, which does not address many of the town's growing needs and will see service cuts in multiple departments at the public schools. We always, in Easton, give these budget presentations to look for revenue side of the ledger first. That is not an accident. That is because our budgets are largely reactive to the revenues that we have available to us. Our budgets are not necessarily built from a perspective of what do the departments, including school, police, fire, what do they need to best serve the community, and what does that cost? We start on the other side and say, what money do we have available, and what is the absolute best that we can produce within the revenue that we have available. So the types of revenue that the town has available, cities and towns in Massachusetts are constrained in their ability to increase the property tax levy by 2.5% plus new growth each year. As you'll see on the chart above me, taxes are the supermajority of the town's revenue, followed by state revenue. Easton has and will continue to levy property taxes to the extent allowed by Prop 2.5, and we've worked very hard to promote new growth, including doing things like negotiating these solar agreements that you hear so that we can boost that tax levy as much as we can. Beyond taxation, Easton captures revenue from state aid, which is the second largest source of revenue. local receipts, and a combination of other funding sources. So total revenue next year is projected at $86.4 million, which is an increase of 3.55%. The fiscal 20 budget projects an increase in total tax revenue of 3.62%, or just over $2 million, for a total of $58,626,312. As I mentioned before, taxation is the largest source of revenue for the town, and it continues to grow as a percentage of where our revenue is coming from each year. And this is a troubling trend because it necessarily and continually increases our reliance on property taxes to bring revenue in to fund the services that we need. And as time passes, this reliance has only been increasing, which places a premium on the town's ability to incentivize new growth to grow that levy. So the table above me, you'll see in fiscal 2017, of our total sources of revenue, taxation was 70.17%. That's increased to 72.5%. That will likely continue. New growth is part of that tax levy. New growth is basically the taxable value of any new or improved property. So if you put an expansion on a restaurant, you build a solar field that we have a pilot for, something like that. And that is outside of the 2.5% constraint of the tax levy increase. So it's really important because that new growth it boosts the tax levy permanently. So expansion, we've been working hard to promote those things through things like expanding infrastructure, major investments in sewer, implementing streamlined permitting, adopting improved zoning, refining the zoning that we have on the books so people can take better advantage of the property that they have to maximize the value of that property, which grows the tax levy. However, as you can see above, broader market trends significantly impact new growth. You can track the Great Recession quite clearly on that graph. Projected growth for 20, we're projecting 700,000 in new growth, which is less than what we actualized in the past 2 years, but it's within the past 5-year history and is informed by actual building permit activity that we've been seeing. So we not only look at trend analysis for projecting these things out, we look at things that are directly related to growth, such as how many building permits are being issued. Moving from taxation, which is the largest revenue source, to the next largest. The next largest revenue source to the town of Easton is state revenue. It is behind taxation. It is behind only taxation in size and relative importance to the budget. State revenue is composed of Chapter 70 education funding, unrestricted general government aid, and other smaller state revenue items. As you can see on the graph above me, state aid to Easton peaked in fiscal year 2008 and it was cut during the recession and did not begin to grow again until 2012. And even once it began growing, it took until 2016 just to get back to where we were in 2008. So those cuts and marginal growth rates have contributed to the persistent structural revenue deficit that this town has and has challenged our ability to fund our services every year since then. Just for an illustrative, sorry, I'm tired. An illustrative example, if you look at the red line between 2008 and 2016, the cumulative lost revenue, just compared to level funding during those 8 years, is over $2 million. The current House budget at the state for fiscal 20 is proposing a marginal increase of $239,066, which is an increase of 1.88%. However, as I mentioned before, in addition to providing critical revenue to cities and towns, the state also assesses certain charges to cities and towns. And the proposed 1.88% increase in state revenue for fiscal 20 is entirely eliminated by increases in state assessments to the town, an increase of $413,203, which is almost 50%. A large part of that is a jump in the charter school assessment of increasing about $350,000 over fiscal year 2019. And the result there is a net decrease of revenue, which you can see on the graph above. The orange line represents the net of state aid.
So you could actually see that under most conditions, the net and the revenue very closely mirror one another. So fiscal 20 is particularly challenging in that regard. The result is a net decrease in state revenue available to Easton of $174,137 next year. Again, just a good point of information, that figure that we're looking at receiving in the net for 2020 is only 4% higher than where we were in 2008. And there's a good kind of analogy made to household budgets. If you think about in your professional or personal lives, the cost of most things have gone up a lot more than 4% in the past 12 years. Again, I think just a helpful illustration, there's a green dotted line on this graph that projects where state revenue would be today had it increased even by 1% annually since that peak in 2008. And if that were the case, we'd be looking at nearly $1 million of additional revenue every year. So to bring that back to the 2020 budget, we are familiar with receiving relatively modest increases to state aid. We're a minimum aid Chapter 70 community. But fiscal 20 is the first budget in a decade where we're actually losing ground in the net, and it's not sustainable. So the challenges that I've highlighted on those previous slides regarding state revenue naturally are related to the increasing reliance on property taxation as a source of revenue. So this table above is similar to the one that we just reviewed regarding property taxation, but it's the opposite trend. You see in 2017, state aid was just under 18% of our total revenue. It's now close to 16%. Both of which are a significant drop from approximately 23% of our revenue before the recession. I do think it's important because I know there's been a lot of really good energy in the community, people paying a ton of attention to the budget, asking how they can be more involved, how they can help. It is important that I think to note that this is not an Easton specific problem. If you go to the Mass Municipal Association website, there's actually 80 cities and towns in the state of Massachusetts that are looking at this net reduction in funding next year. So similarly, that this is not necessarily direct only impacting Easton. If folks are reaching out to our state legislators, understand that those folks do work very hard to advocate for Easton, and that this is a broader challenge for the entire state. Moving into the third largest revenue category of the town, local receipts. Local receipts are composed of things like excise taxes, permit fees, meals taxes, ambulance fees, and other receipts. In prior years, we've highlighted that local receipts have been a relative bright spot as far as percentage-based growth in our revenue picture. However, at that same time, we've tried to be sober in our analysis that would not grow at large percentages every single year. And between fiscal 17 and 18, our actual collections did decline slightly, in part due to a very large one-time building permit in 17, which was Avalon. But nonetheless, we are seeing those actual collections narrow, which is really important. There's some questions, including about the OPEB funding article of, well, if there's excess dollars in an operating budget, can that just be programmed into the coming year? As our revenue projections versus our actual collections narrow as time goes on, which is what we are seeing, that necessarily results in fewer free cash dollars that are generated each successive year. So based on current activity that we're seeing, we're projecting a modest increase for local receipts of 3.62%. That's an increase of just about $250,000 for a total local receipt projection of just over $7.4 million. Reserves. So in addition to those three recurring revenues, another source of revenue in operating budgets or in Easton is reserves. So we've been getting a lot of really good questions about reserves, the status of our reserves, how much we have, why we're building them. And so I think it's productive just to do a brief kind of defining of what we're talking about. So reserves in a municipal context is the sum of your free cash and stabilization fund. Free cash is any excess actual revenue collections, so if you collect more revenue than you projected, and or any excess funding in a budget that you did not spend. So, and Wendy, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way that free cash is generated and then applied to a budget is you have a given fiscal year. In this case, we're in fiscal year 2019. That year will end June 30th. We will not know what free cash for this year is until this year is closed. We close our books and account for that. That usually takes over the summer, and we'll know in the fall. That free cash is then certified. So you will be in fiscal year 20 certifying fiscal year 19 free cash, which cannot be applied to the budget typically until fiscal 21. So that's how that interplays with questions of fiscal year 19 excess funding that may go into a trust fund rather than a 20 operating budget. So that's what free cash is. Stabilization fund is basically a rainy day fund for multi-year economic recessions, rare catastrophic expenditures, and to help address cyclical declines in revenues that are outside of our control. So how are those reserves used? Since the onset of a recession and the subsequent stagnation of state aid after it was cut, the town has been using reserve funds, both free cash, stabilization, and in some years a mix of two, at an unsustainable rate to close that revenue deficit. 3 years ago, the Board of Selectmen adopted a series of guidelines to limit this practice and rebuild our reserves before the next recession, because recessions are cyclical. They are a fact of capitalist economies. There will be another one. It's important to know that these are not just policies that I guess exist for the sake of existing. This is prudent financial practice, and this is basically the minimum that we ought to be striving to do. And that is that no more than 50% of certified free cash would be used in the coming year's operating budget. So when we're talking about the current budget that's proposed for fiscal 20 and the challenges that that budget presents, that is already using half of all the free cash that was available, and that's over $1 million in reserves. A minimum of 25% of that free cash be transferred into the stabilization fund until our total reserves reach 10% of our general fund expenses. So we have been doing that. We transferred a quarter of our available free cash from fiscal 18 into the stabilization fund at the fall town meeting. So then we're now assuming the application of 50% of that into this operating budget. Under normal scenarios, you would ideally be using free cash, which is basically one-time money. Free cash is basically having extra money in your bank, in your checking account at the end of the month that you did not expect. So under normal circumstances, you would want to use one-time money for one-time things, capital costs, replacing police cruisers, helping to pay for building repairs. So necessarily, when you're using a large chunk of your available free cash in every year's operating budget, you are necessarily inhibiting your capital investment. So 50% of the free cash maximum in the guideline to be applied to a coming year's budget, a quarter of that to go into a stabilization fund to save for rainy day, and to limit stabilization fund use to rare or extenuating circumstances. This chart illustrates the reality of what the structural revenue deficit looks like for the town of Easton. It displays the town's cumulative use of reserve funds each year since the last override and the recession which immediately followed it. So the green arrow is over fiscal 7, which immediately followed the last operational override. And as you will see, there was effectively no reserve fund use at that time. There was no structural revenue gap. The red arrow highlights the first round of cuts in state revenue to the town of Easton that occurred once the recession hit, at which time the town began to rely more heavily on our reserve funds, because that's what you build them for, is for those tough times. And what you could see when you look as that chart, I think it's to the right, even above me it is, as you go on from 2009, 10, 11, you see that we have been using between 1 and 2 million, sometimes over 2 million in reserve funds every year to balance the operating budget. And that reserve use peaked at just over $2 million in fiscal 16, and it has dropped since then. The current fiscal year, we programmed 1.2 million. To tie back to Wendy's point, that was half of the certified free cash from 2017. So we're seeing our free cash certifications get smaller and smaller as we kind of push our projections to try to shore up these budgets, which necessarily means fewer one-time money for capital budgets. And it also means fewer money for applying, fewer dollars for applying to the operating budget. The fiscal 20 budget proposes using half of the available fiscal 18 free cash, which is $1,040,000. So again, I think it's important when we're talking about it, when we're deliberating on use of reserves in this budget. This budget is using reserves. It is using over $1 million in reserves already. And specific to free cash, another $500,000 free cash does not exist unless there is no capital budget. Unless all capital needs are deferred. So so that graph showed how much reserves have been going into each operating budget, but what is the actual status of our reserve position? So the reserve position and how that relates to the budget is the accumulation of our stabilization fund and the free cash that we have on hand. In this graph above me, you see stabilization fund balance in blue, and you see the total reserve balance in red. We don't know what fiscal 19's free cash is yet because the year has not closed, so that's why that line stops over 18. As you can see, we've been working very hard to rebuild the stabilization fund, and again, it's not just because there's a policy, it's because it is imperative that if we're going to be thinking about the long-term fiscal health of the entire town and the schools, that we have adequate reserve stores, because inadequate reserve balances, if you are effectively propping up additional spending today that's recurring, that money needs to come from somewhere next year. And so if you think back to this budget, the preliminary cut of this budget began with a $1.9 million projected deficit. That was assuming $1 million in free cash. So if we assumed no use of reserves, then that would have actually been 2.9. So if we were to put additional reserve funding into this budget, and you just roll that deficit into next year, assume we start fiscal 21 with a preliminary deficit of 1.9 million. If you add 500,000 more to this budget today, add 500,000 to that projected deficit right out of the gate.
Can I just add something? I just want to say, we actually don't have $500,000 in free cash to use. Even if we cut everything from the capital budget, based on putting the money from free cash that we're going to put into the operating budget, the only amount left would be about $325,000, and that's if we do no capital. With the planned use for the capital budget, we would end with $125,550 in unspent free cash of what was, based on what was appropriated, what was certified last July, less the transfers into stabilization and the capital we did at the special town meeting, and the $1 million that we're going to put in the operating budget. So we wouldn't even have $500,000 in free cash to use.
Thank you for that clarification. So beyond the importance of just building reserves, I mean, obviously in a vacuum it sounds good to have more money in the bank than less. Reserve balances are something that are looked at every year by bond rating agencies. And they look very, very closely at that, particularly when, if the economy is doing okay, they want to see that you're working to be rebuilding those reserves and limiting your use of the reserves in your operating budget. And so that's really important. If you start pulling down on stabilization funds admittedly there are challenges for our budget, but during a period of economic growth, a bond rating agency could look at that and say, well, that's a real sign of poor fiscal health. And if you have a bond rating downgrade, your interest costs rise. And we're looking at one of probably the largest borrows, I think, ever for the MSBA school project. And so to have a bond rating downgrade before borrowing tens of millions of dollars for a critically needed school building project would actually end up making that project cost more. So the previous slide showed what our actual reserves were in actual dollars. It's important to consider stabilization fund as a ratio to your costs, though, right? We talked about the challenges of if state revenue's up 4% versus 12 years ago, things cost more than 4% more. So before the last recession, our stabilization fund balance was just over $2.9 million, and our general fund expenses for 1 year were just under $60 million. So our stabilization fund ratio was about 4.93%. Right now, our stabilization balance, which is the highest it's been in 10 years because we've been working to put money towards it, is still insufficient. We're making progress, but it is not there yet. We have 2,766,000. So that's less than what we had before the last recession. And in the interim, our operating expenses are 77 million. So when you look at that as a percentage, we're just over 3.5%. So our entire stabilization fund balance is equivalent to 3.5% of a year's spending.
And the target, the goal?
The target is between stabilization and free cash that you're at 10%. So last year that we have that information, right, because we don't have free cash for this year yet. So if you look at our free cash balance and our stabilization balance last year, it was $4.3 million. That total reserve ratio is 5 2/3%, so 5.67%, which is, to some people's point, better than it has been in a few years past. Not dramatically. Before the last recession, our reserve ratio was 7.3%. We want to get that ideally above, the aspirational goal is 10%. Mm-hmm. Even to get to 7, though, we are quite a ways away. So the last year was, as I said, 5.67%. You ideally want to be at 10%. So I guess why does that matter for budgets? Again, in a vacuum, putting more money in the bank sounds good, but the importance, I think, is again illustrated by this graph of cumulative reserve use. So before the last recession, we had over 2.9 million in our stabilization fund, which at the time was almost 5% of our expenses. And even with that, and even coming off the heels of an override, that increased the tax levy, I think, by $3+ million.
3.4.
So with those two things in our favor, that stabilization fund was spent down to fewer than $900,000 in less than 2 years' time, using more than $2 million in stabilization of those 2 years. And even with that, and with applying free cash on top of that, the town and schools still had to cut. So I'm not saying I think that we'll have the Great Recession again, but recessions are cyclical. And when they happen, and you have things like state revenue drops, it's not just state revenue. State revenue drops, building projects stop, building permits stop coming in, people stop buying cars, they go out to restaurants less. It hits across the board. That new growth chart that we looked at is indicative of what we're talking about as well. So it hits everywhere when that happens. And so that's why it's so important that you try to build up your reserves when you can. Other sources of financing is the section of the budget that you have in front of you where reserve use is displayed. In addition to general stabilization funds and free cash, the town maintains separate capital stabilization funds. These are specific stabilization funds where there is money identified to assist with capital costs as well as with the debt associated with capital costs. And so fiscal 20 is programming $250,000 in capital stabilization funds to mitigate a peak year in our debt service budget. There's basically some pay downs in that debt service budget that will fall up. They're going to mature and fall off the books next year in that amount. So it makes sense to use that one-time money there. In total, the other financing sources being used by the town are projected to increase by $104,000, which is 6%. Moving into the expense side, given our revenue challenges, it's really, really, really important that the town and schools work really hard to try and control our costs in areas that we can exert control over. We've done that. We've been very successful in reducing costs in health insurance. We transitioned our employees into the group insurance commission years ago. That saved over $300,000 in that year. We've actualized, or I cannot say we, the state GIC has actualized very modest rates of health insurance growth that have been really beneficial. Going into fiscal 20, our employee benefits and insurance for healthcare is projected to increase by only 1.28%, which is significantly outperforming the market. Most employer-provided health plans are increasing at rates between 3 and 5%. So particularly when you have, between the town and schools, somewhere between 700 and 800 employees, and you have a tremendous amount of retirees, with an overall health insurance budget that's over $8 million, having increases of 1 to 1.25% really helps take some of the pressure off on other areas in the budget. We've maxed out our net metering credits that we can generate in town. Easton's a municipality, we still have to pay National Grid to use electricity. We've maxed out our solar capabilities to reduce our energy costs. We've engaged in ESCO projects to do better enveloping of our buildings, including ones that are 100 years old and are clearly probably not the most energy efficient. We've taken control of streetlights in town, and they're now maintained. We've saved hundreds of thousands of dollars on that by doing that in-house. We've worked really hard to control wage growth. The overwhelming majority of our operating budgets are obviously salaries because public services are delivered by people. Right now, there are, as Mike mentioned in supplementing the council budget, the town works with 8 unions. 5 of those agreements are ratified. All of them are more conservative than they have been in the past. 4 of them took a 0 base wage increase in the current fiscal year. That tremendously helps slow the growth of our operating budgets, which again tries to help whittle away at that revenue challenge we have. So despite all these successes, our total expenditures continue to rise at rates that outpace the modest revenue growth. In summary, the town department budget is projected to increase by 2.13% next year for a total of $17.384 million. It's level service and contractual. It does not address requested needs for public safety or public works. The Easton school budget is projected to increase by 2.5%. I don't have the total on this slide, I apologize. And that increase includes service reductions in multiple departments. So just a highlight of town.
Connor, can you pull that back? I'm sorry to do that. Town department budget increases 2.13.
Yes.
School budget increases 2.5.
That's correct. So the total town, I have it here, total town departments budget, so that includes public works, public safety, general government, health and community services, the library assessment. That total budget's $17,384,000 and change. School department is $42,363,566. So we've heard a lot of feedback regarding the impacts of tight budgets on services, and so this slide shows what the actual projected changes to the town departments are next year, and I think it's informative again to look at the stats that we have from our community comparison report that we reviewed together earlier this season to really kind of make the point that we are working pretty aggressively to operate very lean budgets here. So general government is looking at a 1.09% increase. Public safety is just over 3. Public works is 1.86. Health and community services is a cut of 3.43. Library is 2.4. So again, you're getting a total town departmental growth of 2.1. And I won't read through every one of those per capita spending stats, but this is something we have spent a lot of time on together. So costs are largely driven by what are called fixed costs. Those are cost items that are difficult to contain, that we have little to no immediate control over in a given year. A selection of those are debt service payments, employee insurance premiums and pension assessments, any snow and ice deficits, the Southeastern Regional School assessment to the town, and on the slide above you'll see a selection of those costs. So a couple of those items jump out. One is, as I alluded to, relating to the capital stabilization. Debt service has an increase next year. It's a peak year in debt service of $466,000. That increase is primarily due to the full impact of the energy services contract debt, as well as interim financing relating to sewer projects in advance of the assessment of final betterments on property owners in those districts to recoup some of those costs. So principal payments related to debt maturing, as I said before, that's coming off the books in fiscal 20. is just about $250,000. And accordingly, that's why we're programming $250,000 of capital stabilization funds into this budget to effectively nullify that 1 year peak. Employee insurance is projected to have another advantageous year. Last year, I believe it increased by only 1.01%. This year, it's increased by 1.28%. Something, again, I think it's important to note the lengths we're going to try to work to control growth in our expenses. This year, we implemented basically a health insurance incentive plan through my office that any employee, it's obviously a really intimate choice for people to take a look at what plans they want for insurance for themselves and their family. However, being part of GIC, I think that there's something like 17 plans, I don't know, there's a lot of health options. And it was just effectively an incentive plan that if you switched from some of the most expensive plans, because obviously if the plan is expensive to the employee, the town pays a part of that premium too, so it's expensive to the town. So if you're an employee and you switch from one of those costly plans to a more cost-effective one, we'd pay you a small bonus and net the difference, and that saved the town $100,000 this year in the net. So again, things like that are very helpful. That helps us see increases of only about 1.28%. We have no snow and ice deficit. Thankfully, I won't make another Game of Thrones joke tonight. The pension assessment is certainly a challenge. So we get an assessment from a county pension system. That pension system is obligated, I believe, to fully fund its to reach a full funding ratio at some point in the next decade.
2028.
Thank you, 2028. While they're trying to do that, effectively they're assessing the difference to municipalities. So pensions, the rate that municipal pensions were set at in the past were not sufficient. Is that fair to say? That employee contributions, basically. So depending on when you're hired, you pay newer municipal employees pay a much larger percentage of their pay into the pension system than in decades past.
Years ago, the pension system was basically funded the way OPEB is now. It was funded on a pay-as-you-go basis. And that was not sustainable, just as, you know, paying for other post-employment benefits with health insurance is not sustainable. So the pensions moved to, you know, a different model where you have to not just pay your retirement benefits, but you have to, you know, contribute money for your employees now while they're working and earning that benefit. And that's eventually what we'll have to do with OPEB. But so part of that assessment is it's like basically two things. It's basically your regular cost plus this amortization of this unfunded liability that they're trying to meet by 2028.
Sure, and at that time, we anticipate that that assessment will come down or away?
It should drop significantly, but I think that you'll probably find that there'll always be some sort of, you know, regular cost plus
study,
right plus a new adjustment because, you know, values are going to change every year. So probably every other year you're probably going to see a valuation, and you'll just have to keep funding that. But it should definitely drop significantly from what we're paying now. You know, that would be a good time to, you know, then start funding the OPEB liability.
Sure.
And then you have the Southeastern Regional School budget assessment that's increasing by just over 4%. And the last item there is one of the things I mentioned on the revenue side because it was so noteworthy, which is that's the increase of over $400,000 in the state assessment to Easton, largely driven by the charter school assessment. So in summary, here's a summary of our revenue and expense categories. Again, being a balanced budget, you've same revenue and expense projected here, $86,435,439. It's a 3.55% increase that includes enterprise revenue and expenses. So what we can say about this budget is it is balanced. It adheres to sound financial management principles. It's reactive to revenue constraints and fixed cost increases rather than, as I mentioned earlier, looking at what we need for expenses for programming. It doesn't fund growing needs of public safety or public works. I didn't mention in specifics, but you may recall that police chief has requested, I think, for 3 or 4 years in a row now, the provision of an additional officer so we can have a full-time school resource officer at the public schools and the regional school. That was eliminated. Needs of the fire department were eliminated. Needs in public works weren't even asked for due to revenue constraints, but nonetheless are significant. So it does not fund those growing needs, and it will reduce services of the public schools. The structural revenue deficit born out of the last recession persists. And it's important that we kind of take a long view here, that the challenges we're facing are not new. They didn't occur overnight or out of view. And so I thought it was important, and I said this Monday, repeat myself, this is not intended to be gratuitous, but I think it's important to look at the budget messages that we've been delivering for years now, and I'm not me personally. 2014, as we go forward into fiscal 15, we must make improving the financial position of the town a major priority. Without adequate funding for education, public health and safety, public infrastructure and services for our youth, veterans, and elders, the town will become a less desirable place to live. That was 5 years ago, the fiscal 15 message. 4 years ago, we were getting by for another year. More significant and sustainable revenue will need to be identified by policy decision makers in the future. 3 years ago, going into fiscal 17, since the onset of a recession and subsequent cuts to state aid to the town, we've been using reserve funds to close a revenue deficit at a rate, if unabated, will result in serious cutbacks in services unless replaced with a reliable revenue source. 2 years ago, for fiscal 18, the structural revenue deficit stemming from the Great Recession and the subsequent cuts to state aid remains today and will persist tomorrow. Last year, or current year's budget message, absent significant new revenue, prepare for continued service augmentations or reductions. Reductions in services and capital investments are going to become difficult to avoid in the future. So things that we'll be looking at, in addition to exerting pressure in areas I've talked about, doing major investment in infrastructure, zoning reform, putting downward pressure on wage growth, trying to save money with health insurance, with energy, all of these areas. The schools enacted fee increases last year, the town will be looking at the same. We need to continue putting the pressure on economic development in areas where it makes sense. Despite how challenging it is, we need to continue to try to build our reserves and minimize our reliance on that one-time money now, because if it is challenging now, the challenge will be significantly worse in a down economy. And although this is not directly related to the operating budget, I think it's important when this budget talks a lot about challenges, and I should have led with this. I think I said this Monday. I should have led with it Monday. I will maybe update this before town meeting. Our departments in the town and school do a phenomenal job with the resources that they have. So I don't intend for this to be entirely doom and gloom. We've had numerous internal benchmark studies, we've had numerous external audits, management assessments that have pretty much across the board come back time and time again and shown that we have lean budgets, we spend less per capita than a lot of departments in similar communities. Our departments do a really good job with what they have. They're getting busier and busier and not necessarily growing to keep up with that. And they've done a really great job. And so I think it's also important to have some level of optimism when we're looking at this many challenges, that we think about what are the opportunities that we have. And so thinking about how significant our revenue challenges are, it's important that we think really long and hard about major opportunities like the MSBA early elementary school project, where we would have significant funding from the state for a major capital project, absent which we just simply will not and cannot do within our normal revenue picture. So I do really strongly recommend that for folks who haven't engaged with that project, that they begin to. We actually, many of us just came right from one of those meetings. They should go to its website, which is Easton, EESproject.com, and learn more about that. So those recommendations are important. And they may mitigate our challenges, but it's not going to completely eliminate them. The town and school officials are going to continue to do our best to creatively and reliably deliver services despite these revenue challenges, while working to reduce our reliance on reserves and build our stabilization fund in preparation for the future. Difficult budgeting cycles like this one are going to become more common as time goes on. And while the town will produce balanced budget that live within our means because we have to, we're not realistically, it would be inappropriate of me to suggest that we're going to be able to cut our way out of it and deliver quality services at the same time. So I'd be happy to take any questions you have.
What happens if this budget does not pass a town meeting?
We would call a special town meeting and try again.
Okay.
Connor, you know why the charter school assessment jumped so severely? Was that something from the town? Was that something from the state?
I'm not an expert in the charter school formula, but as I said before, this isn't unique to Easton. There's actually 80 cities and towns in the Commonwealth that are going into fiscal 20 next year that are looking at that net cut in state funding due to the charter school formula. Some of it is enrollment driven. I do feel like it's really important for me to say that this is in no way to blame a family of a kid who goes to a charter school. It's the state's formula. Similarly, not blaming specific legislators, but the formula that is being used right now looks to be resulting in a net loss for a sizable amount of cities and towns next year. So it's not just Easton.
And do you have any kind of idea if that's, you know, if we'll see more jumps in the future or anything like that?
Well, it already has. So similar to our process where we have a preliminary cut of the budget, we refine it. The state goes through a multi-budget process as well, and the first step of that is the governor issues a preliminary budget. And the first cut of the state's budget actually was a net reduction, but it was not this bad. So the assessment estimation has grown already just in this budget cycle.
And I just wanted to add too that, that on the cherry sheet, so we do get some reimbursement from the state for the assessment, but that reimbursement is only about $101,000, but our assessment is $425,000. And that's for about 23 students.
One quick question on the free cash. I know last year there was a lot of emergency items that came up, like broken generators and such things that had to be replaced immediately without waiting. And I know those funds, I believe those funds come from free cash, correct?
It depends. That was in the capital budget, so they certainly needed to be replaced. I'm not saying they're not an emergency, but
yeah, I think one of them a generator on the fire.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So free cash is ideally you would use lots of free cash in your capital budget, but if those specific items I believe we borrowed
We
for.
did.
Okay.
So one of the ways that you try to get creative with these things is that if you don't have sufficient free cash to invest in certain items in your budget, your alternatives are don't buy them, which in the case of 31-year-old generator for a fire station is not really an option. You can't have your emergency operations center not have power in a blizzard. That's life or death. So if you don't have the free cash, you would borrow, and the dollar amount drives that too. But so we did borrow for those in the capital budget last year. You could use free cash.
Okay. When we talk about the free cash planning, do we plan for those kind of emergency situations? Is that kind of already budgeted in there, or is that something that will be coming out of that $125,000 leftover?
Well, so a capital item has to follow the specific process in the capital planning. So I don't, at least in my experience here, we haven't had a capital item that we've, I guess, had good timing that it has been either before annual or fall town meeting, and we've been able to put it through that standard process.
Okay.
But free cash is used to fund, turnout gear, things like that. Whether or not an item is being asked for in the capital plan every year for 5 years and it's finally getting funded, or it's something that's emergency and jumps ahead of the pack, free cash is a critical source of that funding.
Okay.
And even in the capital budget, we have a lot of things that do recur on an annual basis, like police cruisers, town computers, school technology, and we make every effort to not borrow for that because we know that request is coming back year after year.
Right. But knock on wood, if one of those infrastructures breaks, like the computer systems crash out, and they purchase those computers, that would be either borrowed or from the free cash that's left over from.
Right, or you would use capital.
Finance committee for a reserve fund.
Yeah, or we'd come hit you guys up for, I think you have 60 grand.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Regarding our, you talked about our bond rating being partly based on our reserves. Knowing that you haven't been here for obviously most of the year since the recession, do you know how our bond rating has moved, kind of initially after the recession when we started to kind of plow through reserves versus in the years after where we started to rebuild it? Do you know if our bond rating has significantly changed in that time?
Our bond rating has not changed since the recession. I do think we did get a downgrade back in the early 2000s, and that was when Moody's had a different rating system.
Okay.
I think we were an A1, and I think we might have gotten changed to like an A2. But now they've changed that system where our rating is a double A3, but we've maintained that.
Sure.
Right. And so when they do a bond rating issuance, we put those letters online every year, and part of the things that they cite or have been citing recently is how important it is that these policies have been adopted and have been adhered to.
Okay, and is our bond rating more or less in line with other similar municipalities?
It's comparable to some of our peers. Some of our peers do have a slightly stronger bond rating, and obviously if you have a bond rating upgrade, the inverse is true, where a downgrade obviously has negative impacts on your borrowing. Just like if you have a worse credit score, it's going to cost you more to pay your car loan. The inverse is true as well. So doing things like building your reserves, reducing reliance on one-time money can position you for a bond rating upgrade, which helps make your borrowing cheaper, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
And a downgrade could really negatively impact us for the school project, because it's not even just that we're borrowing, that it's a significant amount of bonds to sell in the market, and to get an investor to buy that amount of money
Right after a downgrade.
Right after a downgrade, yeah, you're gonna pay.
Do the reserves grow interest at all? Any of the reserves, do they gain interest?
The stabilization fund.
Stabilization.
Yeah,
The
all
free
the
cash doesn't,
stabilization
though?
funds. No, because free cash is really just a component of your general fund's equity. I guess indirectly it does, because we do have interest-bearing accounts, but they don't generate the kind of income that stabilization funds do, because they're invested a little differently.
Much of what we heard, at the Board of Selectmen's meeting on Monday with people who participated, students, the parents, social media, by email, things that we've already talked about tonight, and again heard eloquently introduced to us, is this compelling request from the concerned citizens and students about the implications and the cuts, of course, to the school budget. Your presentation tonight is, again, thorough and clear. It demonstrates in ways that all people should be able to understand that you and the department heads have met the expectations of the Board of Selectmen to present a level-funded budget. And Connor, your department heads have presented a level-funded budget at your direction, right? And in alignment with the Board of Selectmen. The challenges you face present painful decisions. These are difficult times. The presentation we've seen tonight evidences for us that you are adhering to the financial management guidelines that were adopted by the Board of Selectmen in 2016. And they meet that, the goal to achieve and maintain certified free cash and plus stabilization funds in the general fund equal to 10% of next year's total general fund budget. We're getting there. We're not there. We're getting there. You've done a great job trying to achieve that. Adhering to these financial management guidelines requires discipline, and sometimes it hurts. Sometimes going on vacation, or sometimes buying something you want for yourself or for your home, you'd like to do. But that rainy day fund is an important rainy day fund. I thank everyone who came out to speak on behalf of this particular issue. I do know that the town came out to vote in great majority to not approve an override several years ago. And by doing that, I think we heard one of the selectmen mention on Monday night that vote at that time said, live within your means. We're not willing to pay more. We're not willing to increase those taxes at this time. We've done that. You've done that. The Board of Selectmen have done that. We've lived inside of our means, and you have predicted these days would come. The financial management guidelines talk about saying that, sure, you can use the reserves in extraordinary and unforeseen circumstances. I don't think what we've been presented with represents extraordinary or unforeseen.
It's predicted.
This has been predicted, it's been anticipated, and unfortunately, it's going to hurt and it's going to feel bad. We did see that the town did not increase their budget by 2.5%. You increased by 2.1, I think was the number, 2.3. 2.1, and the school did increase their budget by the 2.5%. I'm going to remind our finance committee members and you new members that several years ago, this committee voted about the tenets that we wanted to assess and measure those recommendations that came in front of us based on as objective criteria as we could. And the first of that criteria was that we sought to replenish and fortify reserves. The second was that we will recommend investments and purchases and approve expenditures that enable additional reserves, additional revenues for the town. The third, of course, is to approve and recommend for vital services and preservation of vital services. The budget, as you presented, was unanimously approved, first of all, in subpart by the school committee, one line item, one section of the total budget. The Board of Selectmen on Monday night unanimously voted to approve and recommend the budget as you've proposed. I feel the concerns of the group here tonight. Nevertheless, using additional stabilization funds, in my opinion, would not be prudent to augment or to move, and certainly is not within our purview to demand or to require that the school committee use funds differently. I ask my fellow finance committee members if there are any other comments or questions or concerns that you may have.
I think you said it very eloquently. Great job.
Having said that, are we ready to vote and recommend acceptance of the budget for 2020?
Make a motion to recommend Article 8, fiscal year 2020 operation.
Second.
All those in favor? That is a unanimous recommendation to approve the budget as presented for 2020.
I wish I had a better, sunnier thing to bring.
particularly for our two new members.
Thank you for the presentation, for delivering it fully and in its entirety again to us tonight. You didn't cut anything.
Sorry. A lot of things in brief is apparently not one.
It's an important topic that deserves the full attention. It deserves the full explanation. And for anyone who's going to come to this and say that there wasn't thoughtful deliberation about this recommendation, I would be hard-pressed to have a disagreement about that, or an agreement that we did not deliberate properly on this issue. Thank you. Thank you.
So if you would like, I can actually be brief with the remaining articles. Articles 9, 10, and 11, as you asked earlier, are relating to collective bargaining agreements. There are 3 town bargaining units that are still under negotiation. These articles are effectively placeholders. They've been included by the selectmen. The selectmen did not vote to recommend them because the contracts are not yet ratified. They may be before town meeting. And if they are, I will either be before Finance Committee,
We meet again on the 8th or on the night of town meeting.
Sometimes does happen as it did in the fall.
We did, yes, we did, sir. Thank you for.
So for these, there's no need for a recommendation because obviously you have no numbers. in front of you.
So the only outstanding for us is 15, the capital budget.
So I will be more brief. Is there a copy of that over? Yes. Everyone has a copy of the capital budget. So this capital budget says preliminary on it. We marked it preliminary at that time just because of the size of the deficit. However, this is exactly as it is contained in your warrant. Just a little bit of background for anyone at home who is still watching, or some of our newer members. The capital budget is a culmination of months of work. We have a capital planning committee of citizens in Easton who each year, after being directed by the finance director, review the capital requests from all town and school departments in what's called a 5-year capital improvement plan. That includes basically non-recurring or occasionally recurring but one-time things such as police cruisers, generators, ambulances, fire trucks, school roofs.
Things we can't fund.
Things
in
we
the
can't
budget.
fund in the operating budget. That's the distinction there. So you received a PDF earlier, you'll receive a full book later, and this list includes the 5-year capital plan, which includes funding recommendations from me for fiscal 20, as well as the requests that are still outstanding for fiscal years 21 through 24. Capital needs of the town of Easton are great. The 5-year plan totals needs of about $79 million. A sizable chunk of that is building maintenance and building repairs needed at our municipal and school facilities, mostly school, just because there's more square footage. Again, highlighting how great of an opportunity that MSBA project is. There was a request for $3.5 million in capital funding this year. I'm proposing a capital budget as in the article and in front of you of $2.1 million approximately. The total of which 1.3 million of that will be funded through borrowing. 408,000 will be funded from a combination of available funds, including free cash, and 404,000 will be funded from enterprise surplus. So there's some capital items that are funded out of enterprise surplus accounts. So things for the water department are funded through water. Sewer items are sometimes funded through sewer. Roberta, do you want me to just go through these, or rather, maybe it's better if anyone has questions about any of them?
Thank you. I'd like to open it up if any of the committee has questions. The first question I ask is, are any of these, superfluous? Anything that we don't need?
No, not remotely.
Thank you.
Not even close. The capital planning bylaw is actually really prescriptive. I always, obviously, have bias. Part of my job is being a cheerleader for Easton, but the charter and the bylaws of Easton are extraordinarily specific and are very descriptive, which is great for people like me. Capital bylaw is very clear. Things that basically jump to the front of the line are life-saving. So you will often see, defibrillators, keeping nozzles on our fire hoses current. Tim can do a better job explaining than I can, but things that are related to actual life and death matters are first. Then you have replacing existing assets. So it has a ranked prioritization laid out in the bylaw.
with proactive needs at the bottom, which we typically cannot even get remotely close to. And so, as I said before, this is $3.5 million in requests for funding, about 2.1. So it's nothing close to superfluous.
Thank you.
And to just add to that, if you look at the last pages of the capital memo,
Yes.
What you'll see is that many of these requests have been sitting here for years.
For a year of year, yeah.
And it just is the case that, as time goes on, new things come up that are very, very urgent. Other things from the past years come up. The big one that stands out to me, obviously, is the EPDM roof on OR. They had originally asked for that back in 2014, and it's been 5 years now. So it's, truly it's triage, essentially.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Which again, that's informed by our, in part, reliance on free cash in the operating budget, but ideally would be being funded for these needs.
John and Emily, so Davis is our capital budget subcommittee appointed volunteer delegate, whatever we're going to call you, right? And Jennifer is on our budget subcommittee with Mike DePietro. I'm on audit subcommittee. Patrick is on the school planning committee subcommittee, and we'll need another one. So next week, when we have a regular meeting, we'll do our committee reorganization and elect officers and go through the administrative functions, but we're not going to do that tonight. You're welcome. But I do want you to know that we do have representation on those subcommittees as this work has been approved and escalated and has made its way onto the warrant.
I just also wanted to add that if you look at this list, there are quite a few items that were requested for fiscal 20 that we've had to push off to the fall. And that doesn't necessarily even mean that they'll definitely be funded in the fall, but we've just deferred the consideration. And there are quite a few things.
They may not be funded, period.
Yeah, DPW motor equipment, the road borrowing, the town computers, police cruisers. So, just didn't have enough to.
I think Emily has a question.
So I just have a quick question about the generator. Like, what types of scenarios would we need this generator in which we wouldn't be able to access a generator through MEMA or an EMAC or something like along those lines?
Well, I don't necessarily know about FEMA bringing a generator in.
Not just MEMA.
MEMA.
Yeah, so I think this is the.
At
This
Frothingham.
one's for Frothingham in this budget, but it's I think a similar question to the generators for fire station and DPW.
Yeah, it's the immediate use part of it. As you know, anytime you enact a FEMA generator or something, it could take quite a long period of time for that material to get down to you for actually setting up for use. Usually when these events happen, it's a statewide event. I think the most recent one was the large storm we had.
The windstorms in March of 2019.
About 95 to 98% of the power in town, which required immediate shelter. We found out some of the shelters, places that were supposed to be having shelters, didn't have the
Power themselves.
generators for power. A lot of those people are auction dependent, those kinds of things, that need immediate access to it. So it's not something that can wait. The amount of time it would take us to get a generator down there, it's something that we need to get the people to someplace within minutes so that they can keep their life-sustaining energy needs up. Yeah, oxygen's one. There's other people that depend on, they call it LVADs, which is basically an electronic device that keeps their heart beating. And then there's obviously respiratory vent.
There's also a continuation of services from a managerial standpoint, like having the Easton EMA operated out of the fire station, where you wouldn't want to lose access even for a minute for kind of the GIS mapping of where our assets are and things like that when we lose power. So we have one here so that if we lose power, it instantly stays on.
And we do have some emergency, like small handheld generators and those kinds of things in the town, but geez, I got hired 15 years ago on the same generator, so we maintain those, but
and the ones we replaced last year were 31 years old.
31, yeah, I mean, so it's yeah, one of those situations.
So we were actually fortunate because we did get some earmark funding
From the state.
to contribute toward those generators. It was 45,000.
Yes, so part of how we're funding a borrow authorization in this capital budget for a third generator is that the cost of the 2 generators that we had in the capital budget last year was lower than we anticipated, and our delegation in the state was able to secure some one-time money for us in the budget. So.
The 54 point, I don't remember if this is the actual one, is that the $54.28 million Whittier facility assessment, that's base repair, I think? Or just bringing back up the code for the
I believe it's base repair, and so those numbers are now outdated. They're 5 years old. So, and part of, as you know, being on the school planning committee, if you counted up the repairs listed here for the K-2 schools in Easton, so they're actually at a lower number in our capital budget than the most recent escalation by our OPM was somewhere near $86 million just for those 3 buildings, which exceeds the entire 5-year needs of the rest of our current plans. So we do know that the dollar value for those 3 from Moreau, Parkview, and Center is actually closer to the mid-80s in millions of necessary repair.
Any other questions? I'd entertain a motion to recommend approval of the capital budget.
Mr. Barger, I'm sorry. I move to accept Article 15, or to recommend Article 15.
Second.
All those in favor? And that's a unanimous recommendation.
Is that everything?
We did it. Thank you very much. As chair, I have the purview to be able to say we're going to defer approval of minutes until next week's regular meeting, unless I have any objections from my cohort here. Committee member comments, if anyone is left who would like to speak.
I just want to say that it's no short order, the turnout tonight from the townspeople. It's impressive to see them come out in force for a good reason. I think it's never an easy decision. I remember when we started doling out assignments I had to schools, I was like, oh my gosh, this is tough, you know. It's a big undertaking, and we've said it once, we've said it 100 times, and I could say it again because it's just the way I feel. It's painful to make those kinds of decisions. There's no, you know, this is a new position for me in the finance committee, but there doesn't seem to be a right decision here. It's just finding the most right, and that's always a difficult way to approach something. So I just wanted to reiterate to everybody at home that we don't make these decisions short-sighted. I think we're trying to look at the forest through the trees, look at the big picture, if you will, and it's a tough one. It's a tough one. So, but I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who's at home now, but they come out tonight. That was impressive, and I appreciate you coming out.
I think too, one of the takeaways from this activity is that what can we do? You know, what are some of the things that people can do? And that means taking it up with your legislators and reaching out to your representatives and reaching out to your state senators to be able to have a conversation with them about how this is impacting the town of Easton, and you know, seeking additional funding or recalibration and calculation of, is it the foundation formula or things like that. So, you know, that's the call to action, I think, that is a worthy recommendation from our group to people who ask when they do say, how can I help? And we have seen that there's been questions about why can't we fundraise for these things, and and Connor hits these points with Wendy. You know, if we put fundraising dollars towards these issues, it's one time. It doesn't stop the problem from happening again next year or the year after or the year after that, or taking money from the stabilization fund and putting it towards the issue. It doesn't stop it from showing up again next year or making it better. And I just have to reiterate, just again, we don't have the authority to dictate how the school committee is going to use or allocate funds that they have. And we've seen Dr. Cabral give her presentations. Her presentations are available. She's released a press release statement describing, you know, some of, and dispelling some of the rumors that we've seen or heard going around about, you know, the entire music program being eliminated. And these things just are not factual. And that's the piece that is worth our finance committee ability to educate and communicate about what is the truth and what is the the knowledge that we do have that we can share with people to educate and inform. Come town meeting, you know, it's going to be a difficult turnout. You know, we've got a lot of people who are, I think, disappointed. And what we need is we need a budget that's level funded to be recommended, yes, by the Board of Selectmen and the Finance Committee now today, to get to town meeting with a vote to approve. And then realize and recognize that we have expertise and a lot of deliberation inside of our department heads under Connor's leadership, the school committee, who are elected officials, to be able to determine how to use those funds properly and appropriately. And it's our job as finance committee to make sure that those deliberations take place, I think, properly, and that we do have good, solid inquiry to make sure that questions that are posed to us from the citizens and from the students, and that we are asking those questions. And I think we did that tonight. So I applaud you and thank you for your support and cooperation.
I just wanted to make one other point, which I think Connor brought up very well earlier, which was, and it's slightly selfish because I'm on this committee, but the level of turnout and passion and engagement we've seen when something like this that obviously hits close to home for the families in town, the people that see this as a difficult year, maybe more so than most other years, because they're seeing a true personal engagement, a personal affectation, let's say, is that we have this incredibly unique, very hard to get, very, very beneficial opportunity with the MSBA project. And that in the conversations that I've had with people and the conversations I've had even at the meeting tonight, there still seems to be a lot of, let's say, lack of understanding or a lack of knowledge about that project that's going on. And if this moment, if this sort of disappointment and the difficulty that we went through with this budget moment wakes someone else up to the fact that we have this other opportunity for a massive reorganization and an incredibly beneficial project for the town that we could never do on our own. If that I don't want to use the term silver lining, because I think it was still overall, we had a very difficult process, but the same level of passion and engagement and push that we saw tonight, I would love to see at the MSBA meetings. Yeah. And if I can plead to the audience at home to come out to those, come on out, we got room. Ask your questions, have the same level of engagement there, so that when this moves forward, because it's in the process of moving forward, and we get to a point that there's going to be a town vote, we don't want people to be in that reactionary moment where they find this out and they get suddenly very, very passionate, let's say. I want that passion now, if we can tap into it, to push this forward, to educate, to engage, and make sure that something like this that addresses so many of the difficulties we've mentioned tonight could be something that we could bring over the finish line for our town.
Very good point. Similarly, too, you know, to be engaged, whether it's to reach out to your legislators or not, but to actively engage in what we're doing here in town. There are so many volunteer opportunities, so many committees, so many opportunities that are public meetings that people can participate in and express their concerns and questions, or be on a committee like ours. Our voter turnout last week was abysmal for an election that, you know, while it was uncontested, you know, congratulations again, you know, while it wasn't uncontested, the turnout, I mean, these are important positions, these are important responsibilities that we have. So, you know, now I'm preaching to the choir. You're all here with me, but I encourage others to participate and engage in these committees.
I just want to thank you for setting a really important tone tonight. You did a really fantastic job out of the gate of handling a very challenging night. This is the hardest meeting I've attended of FinCom. Only a year, but still.
Appreciate that.
I thought marijuana was hard last year, but this is a new high. No pun intended there. I really did not mean to do that. But no, in all seriousness, like you set a tone and led the meeting in a way that allowed for engagement and thoughtful dialogue, and that was very important. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Seconded.
Agreed, yeah.
Oh, motion.
Motion to recognize Roberta.
Second.
All those in favor? Okay, community participation, if anybody's left and would like to speak, we welcome your comments, and thank you. We recognize Mr. Barger from the Board of Selectmen. I don't know if he's here in the Board of Selectmen capacity or as a concerned citizen.
I'm here both, I think, as a member of the board as well as a concerned citizen, and I just wanted to once again thank my friends on the Finance Committee for an incredibly thorough and thoughtful discussion and review of the warrant articles, particularly the budget. You all know how difficult it was on Monday night for the select board to make that decision after hearing from some very compelling students and parents about their concerns about this town. I respect all of those folks who came out. I actually was amazed at a couple of students, fourth grader and a sixth grader, who, if I were a fourth grader and sixth grader, I don't think I could have gotten up in front of that audience and spoken. And I wanted to thank you guys for what, for me, was my most difficult decision that I've ever had to make as a member of the Board of Selectmen. I'm sure, from what I hear tonight, it was very difficult for you as well. I would like to second or third your comments, Ms. Stacy, about Roberta's presentation and her role as chair. It was impressive, and I want to thank you for that, both for your thoughtfulness as well as your establishing a standard of civility and discussion, and allowing people in the community to make their presentations as well. I want to thank Wendy and Connor. I've seen this presentation now 5 times. I learned something each time I listen to it, and I just want to say that it's very impressive and it's very thoughtful. I talked to a number of people today who were at the hearing on Monday, and I've seen some emails that were very thoughtful and thanking both Wendy and Connor for the presentation, and it was very helpful to them, and it counters some of the inaccuracies that you mentioned this evening, Roberta, that comes from Facebook and other social media things. I'm also aware that Connor spoke to the fact that there are 80 towns that are in our similar situation. I've spoken to members of the legislature today and learned that Dr. Cabral was in today speaking to members of the legislature on behalf of the schools, on behalf of changing the foundation budget. And she was followed by 3 or 4 other small towns in our area that have exactly the same problem. So it is huge statewide. It's not just Easton. And I've spoken to one of our other senators who indicated that all of his cities and towns, 10, are facing the same kind of situation, and they are not. He is not willing to be part of a process and lesson until he knows how the budget will impact his 10 cities and towns. So anything you can do to encourage and support our legislators in that endeavor to change that foundation budget would be greatly appreciated. So thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Barger.
Thank you.
I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
Oh, I thought you'd never ask.
I'll second that.
All those in favor? Thank you all very much. Thank you and good night.